Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. Today I'm sharing 52 of my favorite fall decor DIYs that I've done so far here on my channel. Keep in mind they are labeled a little bit out of order since this is a combination of a lot of my projects put together. I hope that you enjoy. Now let's go ahead and get right into it. For the first DIY today, I'm going to be starting out with one of these unfinished wood canvases from Hobby Lobby, and I'm going around and staining the entire outside of the frame with my folk art wood tint in the color walnut. Once I have that stained, I'm then going to be painting the entire inside of my piece with my Waverly paint in the color ivory. I'm also going to be using 12 of these unfinished wooden pumpkins, and these ones are from Hobby Lobby this year. I'm painting the bottom portion of the pumpkin with a Pueblo colored paint from Folk Art, and then for the stems, I'm just using a dark brown color. I did want to add some dimension to the front of the pumpkins, so here I'm just using that same dark brown color and painting on two curved lines on each pumpkin. Next, I'm just taking all of my pumpkins and placing them inside of my wooden frame. I'm doing 3 pumpkins across and 4 pumpkins going down. So here I have 12 total. Once I have them all spaced out the way I want them to be, I'm going through and hot gluing each one of them back down. I could have left this piece just like it is, but I did want to add some detail. So here I'm using a few strips of raffia and I'm creating a really small, simple bow. And I did 12 of the bows total so that I could add them right underneath the stems on all 12 of my pumpkins. To attach the bows, I used just a little bit of hot glue, and this is what the piece looks like all finished. Super simple, but I absolutely love the way that it turned out. Moving into DIY number 2, for this project, I'm going to be using this piece from Hobby Lobby that I recently got on clearance for $1.64. It says home on the front, and I was just going to flip it over and do a fall sign on the back so that I could still have the home sign, but I ended up just painting over that word and just doing it all the same color. So here I'm painting all 4 of the squares with my Pueblo colored paint from Folk Art. And then I'm also going to be using these unfinished wood letters from Hobby Lobby to spell out the word fall. And then I'm taking my white paint marker and then just painting over all of the letters. After the paint dried, I went through and hot glued each one of those letters onto all 4 of those squares. And then I'm going to be adding some of these leaves. These ones are from Dollar Tree, and I believe they're like cupcake toppers, but I wanted to take the wood piece out of them. So here I just used some pliers, kind of like loosened up that glue and then just pulled them right out. I am going to be using just the yellow and the green leaves that come in that pack from Dollar Tree. And I just kind of randomly hot glued the leaves onto the wood pieces around all of the letters. And I just thought it looked really cute. But then I thought that I wanted to make those squares into pumpkins. So here I'm using these like really small mini, I think they're like wooden spools, and I'm staining them with that same walnut wood tint. And then here I'm just going to be hot gluing them onto the top of all 4 of my squares to create what looks like a pumpkin. Then to add a little bit of extra detail, I'm making 4 really small bows out of raffia, and then I'm going to be hot gluing each one of those bows right underneath the wooden spools or pumpkin stems. And this is the piece all finished. I think it turned out really cute with a high-end look, and what makes it even better is it was super easy to do. Now moving along into DIY number 3. For this one, I'm going to be using one of these pumpkins from Dollar Tree, but it is one of the $3 pumpkins since it's a little bit larger. And I first started by just removing the stem on the pumpkin. I'm also going to be using some of these really beautiful napkins from Hobby Lobby. And you know how napkins have like that texture around all of the sides? Well, I wanted that off. So here I'm either using my scissors to cut the edge off, or I'm just tearing that edge off. So once I have all of the textured pieces of the napkin off, I'm then going to be just tearing the napkin into long strips. And I did forget, I did take that second layer of the napkin off as well. And I did use several napkins for this project. But once I have all of my strips ready to go, I started using my matte Mod Podge to glue them onto my pumpkin. And I did layer pieces of the napkin and overlap them. So I just went around the entire pumpkin and basically did the same steps, just painting on the Mod Podge over the napkin to glue it on the pumpkin. So once I've done that to the top portion of my pumpkin, I then flipped it over and then started doing the same thing to the bottom of the pumpkin, overlapping all of the napkin pieces and just gluing them on. For the stem of this pumpkin, I am going to be using one of these unfinished wooden finials from Hobby Lobby, and here I'm just staining it with my walnut colored wood tint, and these do come 3 in a pack from Hobby Lobby. So once I have that all stained, I then decided I wanted to add some beads and a tassel to this pumpkin. So here I'm just stringing on 4 of these wooden beads onto a piece of jute. Once I have the beads on, I then am going to be creating a tassel. So here I just took a piece of jute and I wrapped it around my hand about 10 or so times. And then once I have all of that, I'm going to be taking another strand of jute and then just tying that around the center of all of those pieces like you can see me doing here. I'm then going to be cutting the bottom of all of those loops, and then here I'm just kind of trimming up all of the ends of the jute to make them all even for my tassel. I'm then taking another small piece of jute and I'm going to be tying it just a little bit down from the top of where all of those jute pieces meet together, where I had originally had them tied in a knot, and then I'm just trimming off the ends of those. Now you can see I have these 2 long pieces at the top, which I end up cutting off because I didn't need them. But this is where I'm just going to be attaching the beads to the tassel. I put the strand that was on the beads through that little hole at the top of my tassels. And then I'm going to be taking that same strand and working it all the way up back through all 4 of my beads so that they are all attached. This is what the beads and the tassel looks like all together. It was hard to explain, so I hope I made some sort of sense while I was explaining it. And then here I'm taking the pieces of jute that were on the ends of the beads and I'm wrapping that around the bottom of my finial just to hold them until I can get them into my pumpkin. So here I'm then just going to be placing some hot glue in the hole on the top of the pumpkin, and then I'm placing that finial with the jute inside that hole. Now that I have the stem of my pumpkin in place, I did want to add some detail. So here I'm using some stems off of one of these picks from Hobby Lobby. I just cut off some of the raffia and then some of the white colored florals, and then here I'm just hot gluing them around the finial. And then for the raffia, I ended up just gathering those pieces in the center and kind of twisting them so that they will stick up a little bit. So once I have that attached, I thought it would be super cute to add a raffia bow because I love raffia bows. And this one did come from Hobby Lobby and it already had the button on it. So this was a super easy and cute idea. I've seen this done before, but I wanted to do my own spin on it with these beautiful napkins that I found, and I love it so much. Now going into DIY number 4. For this one, I'm going to be using one of these signs that came from Hobby Lobby. It's already done. It already has the stain and it's already painted white in the middle. I'm also using 2 of these unfinished wooden pumpkins, and the first thing I'm doing is painting the pumpkins, and I'm using the color Pueblo, no surprise, and then for the stems I'm painting them brown. I'm also going to be using some of these unfinished wooden letters from Hobby Lobby to spell out the words pumpkin patch, and I wanted the letters to kind of match the outside of that frame, so here I'm just using some of my walnut wood tint to stain all of the letters. After the stain was all dry, I started just placing the letters in the center of my sign just to kind of figure out where exactly I'm going to place them before I start using some hot glue to attach each one of the letters down. Once I have them all attached, I'm then going to be attaching a pumpkin on each side of my words, again just using some hot glue to attach them. And you probably guessed it, I did make two very simple raffia bows for my pumpkins. Once I had them made, I hot glued them onto the bottom of the stems, and then here I'm adding two of these brown color mini buttons right in the center of both of my bows. And that was the last step for this project, and this is what the sign looks like all finished. I think it looks super high end. It was so easy to do, just like the rest of the projects so far in today's video. I really love this one. Please let me know what you think. Now moving on to DIY number 5. For this one, I'm going to be using one of these pumpkins from Dollar Tree, and I'm first just going to be removing the tag and then also the stem on the pumpkin. For this project, I'm going to be using a bunch of strips of corn husk, and I actually got these in a bag from Hobby Lobby, and I'm just going to either be cutting the strips with scissors or just tearing them apart. And then I'm just going to simply hot glue the corn husk strips right onto my pumpkin. And I did have to go through and make sure that the strips that I was using are long enough to go all the way from the top and all the way to the bottom of my pumpkin. I continued to do those same steps over and over again, just hot gluing the corn husk onto my pumpkin, and I did overlap each corn husk as I went around gluing them on the pumpkin. And like I said, I just did that over and over again until I had my pumpkin completely covered in the corn husk. For the stem of my pumpkin, I was going to use this larger finial, but I thought it was too big for this particular pumpkin, so I'm just using this other little wooden piece that I've already stained with a walnut colored wood tint, and here I'm just hot gluing it to the very top of my pumpkin. Then I thought it would be really cute to add some of these like deep orange color floral stems. These I did just pick up from Joann Fabrics, and I'm going to be hot gluing them on the top of my pumpkin right next to the stem. I'm then using some of this smaller burlap ribbon from Hobby Lobby to create a very small, simple bow. Once I have that made, I'm going to be hot gluing it right in the center of those floral stems. I'm then adding one of these unfinished wooden buttons to the center of my bow, and then I'm adding another wooden button right in the center of that one. And this is my corn husk pumpkin all finished. I will definitely be making multiple of these this season. They go with the fall decor that I currently have in my home. For the first DIY in today's video, I'm going to be starting with one of these unfinished wood round pieces from Hobby Lobby, and I'm going to be staining it with my folk art wood tint in the color walnut. Once this piece is all stained, I'm then going to be using these two unfinished wood mini candlesticks. These ones are also from Hobby Lobby, and I'm staining them with that same walnut tint. Another piece I'm going to be using in this project is this unfinished wooden pumpkin shape, and this one did come from Dollar Tree this year. I'm just going to be removing the tag off of the back, and then I'm painting the entire pumpkin with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. After I had the pumpkin painted, I then noticed that I had this really pretty craft paper with pumpkins on it that I wanted to use on top instead. So here I'm just cutting that paper down to where it'll fit over top of my pumpkin, and then I'm using some matte Mod Podge on the pumpkin so that I can apply the paper to the very top. Then I'm going to be placing the paper over top, just pressing out any of the bubbles that are underneath, and then I'm going to be letting that dry for about 15 minutes before I go in with some sandpaper, and I'm just sanding away all the excess paper around the edges of the pumpkin shape. Once I have that sanded off, I'm then going to be taking some more of that matte Mod Podge and just sealing the paper onto my pumpkin. Next, I'm using some hot glue on the top of one of the candlesticks, and I'm going to be attaching it to the top of the second candlestick. I'm then going to be using some hot glue to attach those right in the center of my stained wood round. Next, you can probably guess, I'm going to be attaching the pumpkin right to the top of the candlestick. And this is my pumpkin shaped riser. I think it turned out so cute, and it would be perfect on a tiered tray this fall. Moving right along into DIY number 2, for this one I'm going to be using this unfinished wooden cube frame. Originally it's from Hobby Lobby, but I got mine at Goodwill for $3.99. As you can see, it is on a spinner and it just spins around. Next, I'm going to be taking off the top piece and then removing the frame glass as well as the backings from all 4 sides. I'm then going to be using my walnut colored wood tint on the base, the frame, and then also that wooden top piece. Then for the 4 backing pieces of my frames, I'm going to be painting them all with my Waverly paint in ivory. I'm also going to be using 4 of these unfinished wooden pumpkin shapes. These ones I believe came from Michael's last year, and I'm going to be painting all 4 of them with a color from Folk Art called Pueblo, and then for the stems, I'm just using a dark brown paint. I thought it would be really cute to add this wooden finial topper, so here I'm just getting a drill bit that's the same size as the bottom of the finial, and I'm drilling a hole right in the center of my top piece. I'm then going to be painting that finial with my ivory colored paint, and then I'm going to be just placing the bottom of the finial through the very top and then using some hot glue before I screw it all the way down just to hold it into place. I'm then going to be placing the backings back into all of their slots. I did leave the glass pieces out of this project. And then I'm going to start attaching my pumpkins right in the center of all of those ivory colored backing pieces. And I did the shorter pumpkin, then on the next side I would do the larger pumpkin, then the next side the shorter pumpkin, then the larger pumpkin on the last side. And then to add a little bit of detail, I made 4 really small raffia bows, and then I'm just going to be adding them to all 4 of the pumpkins right underneath their stems, and I'm just using some hot glue to attach them. And here is the piece all finished. I love how it turned out. I think it's a lot different than anything else that I've created for fall. And this is what it looks like all around. I wanted to let you guys see all sides, and I think it just turned out really cute and it was easy to do. Now moving into the 3rd DIY for today. For this one, I'm going to be starting with one of these round foam balls. This one I got from Hobby Lobby from the Christmas section. And then here I'm just taking a small saw and just sawing off the top round portion of the ball. And then I'm also doing it on the bottom side of the ball so that I have kind of a flat side on both the top and bottom. I then needed a hole in the center, so here I'm just taking one of my drill bits and then just drilling out a large hole in the foam. Next, I'm going to be using some of this white macrame cord, and this one is from Hobby Lobby, and I'm going to first start by attaching it to the inside of my foam where that hole is, and I just attached it using some hot glue. I'm then going to be wrapping that cord around my foam, and I just continued doing that over and over again, and then I would use some hot glue just to keep the cord in place. Every so often, after I would wrap it a few times, I'd add a little bit of hot glue and then continue wrapping some more. So once I have the entire piece wrapped in this cord, I just use the hot glue once again just to secure the end piece of my cord. This is what the piece looks like once it's all wrapped with that macrame cord. I'm then going to be adding one of these stem pieces that I had in my craft stash, and I just added it using some hot glue. And then of course you can tell I'm making a pumpkin. Now I'm going to be using some of these pretty floral pieces from Joann Fabrics, and I just cut them down to the size that I wanted, and then I'm hot gluing them around that stem piece at the very top of my pumpkin. I did want to add a little bit of pop of color, so here I'm adding some of this orange and cream color checked ribbon. I created a simple bow and then hot glued it in front of my stem, and then I'm adding one of these little wooden buttons right in the center of my bow. Here is my little pumpkin all finished. I am going to be creating so many more of these this fall, and I'll be using a different color of either macrame cord or yarn to create them. Next up is DIY number 4. For this one, I'm going to be using this really beautiful pumpkin placemat from Hobby Lobby. It was $6.99, but I got mine for 40% off, and I'm going to be using 2 of these same placemats for this project to create a pillow. First thing I did was just removed the large tag that was on both placemats, and then I'm going to be taking the first mat and placing it with the front side down. I'm then going to be taking my second one and placing that right over top of the other one with the pumpkin right side up. I'm getting the scalloped edges exactly the same so that they're even. And then here I'm just going to be hot gluing the edges together. I did the top and bottom of the placemats, and then as well as one of the sides. The other side I left open because that is where I'm going to be putting all of my polyfill to fill up my pillow. You could always use a fabric glue, or if you are a sewer, you could definitely sew these placemats together, but I just chose to do hot glue. So here I'm just using some polyfill that I had in my craft stash. I always have this on hand, and I'm just filling up the pillow, and then once I have all the polyfill in, I'm going back through with my hot glue and just closing up that very last side. And here we have my finished fall pillow. I think it looks so beautiful, and I was able to create this for about $8.50, so much cheaper than if I were to buy a fall pillow already made. Now we have the 5th and final DIY for today. This one is super simple. I recently picked this like tiered cutting board up from Michael's. It was like 75% off, so I think it was only like $3 or $4. And I'm going to be using this. My favorite color is October Stencil right on the front. So I'm getting it exactly where I want it to be. And then I'm just going to be using some tape to hold the stencil down. And then I'm going to be going in with my ivory colored paint from Waverly with a stencil brush and just stenciling that saying on the front of my cutting board. After the paint was dry, I then removed the stencil, but I did want to use some of that wheat or like flowers that are on the stencil, but I wanted them in a different place than they were like next to the words originally. So here I'm just going to be using some tape after I place it where I want it to be once again, and then just using that same ivory color to stencil on those flowers. This stencil is from Amazon, and I will try to have it linked down in my description box. This is what the piece looks like all finished. It was super simple, and I just think it turned out really cute. It might even be adorable with a little pumpkin set on top. For the first DIY today, I'm going to be using one of these unfinished wood apples from Dollar Tree. It has a little like holder or box on the inside, and then the 2 apple shapes on the outside. The first thing I'm going to be doing is painting both sides of the apple shape, and I just mixed 2 colors from Folk Art. They're the colors Imperial and Tuscan Red. Then for the leaf portion on this apple, I'm using the color Spanish Moss, also from Folk Art. And then for the stems of my apple, I'm using the color Raw Sienna, also from Folk Art. For this project, I'm also going to be using the wheels that came from this race car wood shop pack from Dollar Tree, and you can get this in the toy section. These are what the wooden wheels look like, and since they do have a little hole in the middle, I just placed them on a dowel, so it was a little bit easier for me to paint, and I painted all of them with a black chalk paint. Then for the center of my wheels, I'm going to be using 4 of these wood rounds. These did come from a Dollar Tree assorted wood pack that I got a few years ago, and I'm going to be painting all 4 of them with my plastered color chalk paint from Waverly. For this project, I'm also going to be needing to make a handle. So for this, I just used a wooden dowel from Dollar Tree, and I've cut it down. The longer piece is 3 inches, and then the shorter piece here is 1 inch. And I painted both of these pieces with that same plaster colored paint. To go on the very front of my apple, I did already create this little decal on my Cricut, and I will have it linked down in my description box if you guys are wanting to use it as well. I just got it all centered in the middle of my apple and got it transferred, and then it was time to start attaching my wheels. I used hot glue to do this, and I just placed the wheels at the very bottom of the apple where it goes out a little bit, and then right in the center of the black wheels, I added those little wood rounds that I painted with the plaster color. Then I'm taking one of these tumbling tower blocks from Dollar Tree and I'm painting it with the plaster colored paint. Then once the paint has completely dried, I'm then going to be using hot glue to attach it to the very bottom of my apple, but I am going to be leaving about 1/4 of an inch of the block sticking out, and this is where I'm going to be attaching the handle to the wagon that I have now created. Now I did want the handle to my wagon to stick out kind of on a diagonal, so I just held it out and then just placed a bunch of hot glue at the very bottom and then just held it into place until the glue completely set. I did end up going back through and adding some of that plaster colored paint over the glue just to cover it up, and then I am going to be attaching with the hot glue once again the little 1-inch dowel handle part. Next, I'm going to be using 5 of these unfinished wooden apples or pumpkins. You can use them for either one, and they are from Dollar Tree. I'm going to be painting all 5 of them with that same paint that I created earlier, the Imperial and the Tuscan red color mixed together just to make this deeper colored red. And then for the stems of all of the apples, I'm using the color Raw Sienna. Now it was time to start filling the inside of my apple wagon. I first took a piece of floral foam and just set that in the inside, and then I took some of what looks like faux straw. You can also get this at Dollar Tree. I just cut it up a little bit and then placed it right over top of the floral foam. And then over top of the straw, I'm just placing all of my little apples on the inside. Now, once I had them all placed in, I didn't really think that they popped being all of the red color, so I did end up going back through and repainting 2 of the apples the Spanish moss color from Folk Art, and then I ended up liking the way that that looked a lot better. And here is my apple wagon all finished. This was such a fun and easy project, and I love how it turned out. I'm really enjoying having some of the apple decor in my home this fall. It's just a little bit different than all of the pumpkins that you see everywhere. Moving right along into DIY number 2. For this one, I'm using one of these arrow signs that you can get from Dollar Tree. This one does say ceremony on it, and obviously I wanted to switch it up a little bit. So I'm just painting over the entire arrow with my plaster colored chalk paint, and I did do 2 coats just to get that ceremony word all covered up. I'm also going to be using 3 of these unfinished wooden apples from Dollar Tree, and I'm painting all of them with that same red color that I created in the last project. It was Tuscan red and Imperial mixed together to create this really deep red color. And then for the stems of all of the apples, I'm painting them with Raw Sienna, and then for the leaves, I'm using the color Spanish Moss. Another item I'm going to be using from Dollar Tree to create today's project are these unfinished wood letters, and I'm spelling out the word apples. For each letter, I'm going to be painting them with my rich black chalk paint from Folk Art. Then before I start adding anything, I decided to use some of that same black colored chalk paint to distress my arrow. I mainly used the color around the edges, but I did do a little bit of distressing on the midsection of the arrow as well. And then once I had that all finished, I started just placing my letters right in the center of where I'm gonna want to attach them. I always like to do this before I start just hot gluing them down because I want to make sure I have them in the correct spot before I actually glue them down. So as you can see here, I'm just using hot glue to attach each letter. Originally, I was just gonna leave the apples plain and add some Spanish moss over top, but then I changed my mind and ended up using this black and white checked ribbon from Dollar Tree. I just tied it around the stem and leaf of the apple and then just made a really simple bow and then cut off the ends of the bow to the length of my liking. And then I did this for all 3 of the apples. I also wanted to make the apples pop a little bit more, so I took some of my plaster colored paint and I dry brushed that around all of the edges of the apples, and then I used a little bit on the fronts of the apples as well. Now that I have all of my apples ready, I can start gluing them to the very back of my arrow. I started with the center apple first, and then I hot glued the other 2 apples on each side of the one in the middle. And this is what my apple sign looks like all finished. Again, another really easy and inexpensive project for this fall, and I'm really loving the apples this year. Now getting right back into the DIYs. For DIY 3, I'm going to be using 2 of these wooden crates from Dollar Tree, and I'm going to be using my folk art wood tint in the color Walnut. I'm just painting it on with a small brush so that I can make sure that I get in all of the little grooves on the crate, and then once I have a good section painted, I just wipe the excess off, and I continued to do that until I had both crates all stained. I'm also going to be using this paint stick that I've already cut down to 5 1/4 by 1 inch. Now this I did not get at Dollar Tree, it was just in my craft stash, but you could always use one of the wood planks from Dollar Tree like this one here and then just cut it down to the size that I'm using. For my paint stick, I am going to be painting it with this plaster colored chalk paint from Waverly, and then I'm using 5 of these wooden apples. These I got off of Amazon and they are such great quality. If you want to check them out, I will have a link down in my description box, and I'm painting them with that same color I created, the Tuscan red and Imperial mixed together. I'm just painting the front of all of the apples this color, and then for the stems I'm using raw sienna once again, and then the leaf on the apples I'm using the color Spanish moss. Now this project that I'm doing is mostly Dollar Tree. You will see a few items that are from a few different places, but mainly it will be from Dollar Tree. To go in the center of each one of the apples that I just painted, I wanted to have mini letters to spell out the word apples. So I cut them out on my Cricut, and then I'm just transferring them to the center of each one of my apples. If you don't have a Cricut to cut the letters out, you can use stickers from Dollar Tree, or you can even write them out with a white paint marker. Next up, I'm going to be using 4 of these wood dowels from Dollar Tree. They are 8 inches long, and I'm using my folk art wood tint in the color Walnut. I'm just painting the tint on and then using an old towel to wipe away the excess. And again, I did this for all 4 dowels. Then it was time to start assembling everything together. I hot glued both of the crates together, but for the top crate, I had it so that it was glued to the bottom crate with the bottom on top, if that makes sense. I'm then going to be hot gluing 2 of the dowels together, and then I'm taking those 2 dowels and hot gluing them on the left side of the top of my crate. I'm then doing the same thing for the leftover 2 dowels. I'm gluing those together and then hot gluing those 2 on the right side of the top of my crate. Now going back to the mini apples, I'm taking each one and placing it in the center of that paint stick that I had painted with the color plaster, making sure they're all centered, and then just hot gluing each one of them back down into place. I'm then using hot glue to attach the paint stick to the very top of my dowels, and I did leave about a 1/2 inch of the dowel sticking out at the top. Next, I'm going to start creating all of the little detail pieces I'm going to be adding. So first up, I just took some burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, and I'm cutting that to the length that goes between my 2 dowels. I'm going to be creating a mini banner. So once I have that piece cut, then I'm just cutting this piece of burlap ribbon in half to create a thinner piece. And then I'm going to be just cutting triangles going all the way up to the very edge of the ribbon. And I just continue to do that all the way down the ribbon so that it then looks like a banner. I then thought it would be really cute to add some of this red and white checked cardstock. This I believe is from Hobby Lobby. So I just cut a strip of it, and then from the strip I'm just going to be cutting tiny little triangles, because these little triangles are going to go right in the center of the burlap ribbon triangles that I just cut. To attach these little triangles, I'm just using a tiny bit of hot glue in the center of the burlap ribbon and then just pressing the cardstock over top of that to attach it. Now that I have my banner created, I'm using hot glue at the very top of the left-hand side of the banner and just gluing that under the A, and then I'm using some hot glue all the way on the right side of the banner and hot gluing that side underneath the letter S. I thought it would be really cute to add some mini apples to this piece. So to do that, I'm using some of these mini wooden beads from Dollar Tree, and I'm just placing them on this little piece of wood that I had. I thought it would be a lot easier to paint them this way. And the color that I'm using to paint my apples is Imperial from Folk Art. I did not mix this one. I used just the straight Imperial to paint all 4 of these beads. And then I wanted to add some green apples as well. So the color I'm using for these is the color Spanish Moss from Folk Art. Now that I have all of my apples painted, I then needed to create stems for them. To do that, I'm just using this piece of balsa wood that I had in my craft stash, and I'm painting it with the color Raw Sienna. Once that paint dried, I'm then using a utility knife to just cut very small chunks of this off. If you're not familiar with balsa wood, it is a very soft wood that's super easy to cut and really easy to dent up as well. So after I had the chunks all cut off, I realized that they were just a little bit too thick. So then I just used my utility knife again to just cut that in half. And then I hot glued each one of those little pieces inside of my little bead to create my apple. I then continued to do that same thing for the rest of all of my beads to create all of my apples. Next, I'm using one of these glass bottles from Dollar Tree, and I thought it would be a really cute idea to make this my apple cider jug. So I'm taking the Raw Sienna color from Folk Art and I'm just squeezing it right inside of the bottle, and then I'm gonna put the cork back on the bottle and then just roll the bottle around so that the paint coats the entire inside of the bottle. I'm then using a smaller bottle also from Dollar Tree, and I'm doing the same thing with this one. I'm just putting a little bit of that Raw Sienna color inside of the bottle. Only this time I didn't wait around for it to coat the inside. I just took a paintbrush and painted the inside of the bottle, and then once it was completely coated, I put the cork back on. Next, I'm going to be creating mini labels for my apple cider bottles. I'm using this red and white cardstock from Hobby Lobby, and I'm just cutting a piece of it out. As you can see here, I already have a piece of white cardstock that I cut out and then with a pen wrote the words apple cider on. I lost that clip, but it's really easy. You just cut out cardstock and write the words on it. And then, as you can see here, I'm just cutting that red and white checked cardstock down so that it goes right behind the white cardstock. I'm then taking the checked cardstock and hot gluing it to the front of my bottle. And then once that's attached, I'm using my glue stick from Dollar Tree to attach the apple cider cardstock over top of the checked cardstock. I then created a second one for my second bottle, only this time I did it a little bit easier. I just used my glue stick and attached the apple cider cardstock right over top of the checked cardstock before I attached it to my bottle. You would have thought I would have done this the first time, but I didn't. So it was a little easier this second time around. Next, I'm taking 2 popsicle sticks from Dollar Tree, and I'm gonna start by cutting off the round ends. And I just did that with my utility knife. I scored over it in the same spot several times and then just snapped it off. It was really easy to do this. Just be careful, you don't want to cut yourself. I then cut the other side of the popsicle stick to the length that I wanted it to be the same way. I just scored over it several times and then just snapped the stick in half like you can see me do here. And then I did another one the exact same length because I am going to be creating a small box. This little piece of wood that you saw there, it is going to be the bottom of my box. It did come from the assorted wood pack that I got from Dollar Tree, and it needed to be a little bit shorter because I needed it to be the same length of the popsicle stick that I just cut. So here I'm just cutting that down to size. And then I needed to do 2 smaller ones to go on each side of the little box that I'm making. So as you can see, I'm just making sure I have it marked to where I need to cut, and then doing the same thing with my utility knife that I did with the other pieces. Just scored over them and snapped them in half. And since I need 2 to go on each side, I cut out 2 of them. I'm then painting all of those pieces with my plastered colored chalk paint, and I did have a few leftover cut pieces that I'll be using for signs on my piece. Then I'm going to be assembling everything together. I used hot glue to assemble my little rectangle box, and As you can see here, I did the 2 longer side pieces first, and then I attached the 2 shorter pieces on each end. Once my box is all complete, I'm then going to be adding some straw from Dollar Tree to the inside. And I'm using hot glue first on the inside and then just pressing that straw over top to make sure that it's nice and secure. And then I'm going to be adding the mini apples that I made earlier on in the video. I'm using 2 red ones and 2 green ones, and I'm just hot gluing them right over top of the straw. Next, I'm going to be creating a sign to go on the front of my crate. I'm using one of these wood planks from Dollar Tree that I've already cut down, and I'm painting it with my plastered colored chalk paint. Once the paint has dried on this, I'm then going to be transferring on one of these decals that I created with my Cricut. It says pick your own with 3 apples underneath. If you guys are interested in using this cut file, I will have it linked down in my description box. After I have it all transferred on, you will see what I'm doing here. I ended up writing a bunch of stuff underneath the pick your own decal that I made, but I did not like it at all. So you can see this is what it looked like, and then I decided that I didn't like it. So I'm just using my utility knife to cut it off where I had wrote all of the words underneath. I don't like my handwriting and I think it looked really sloppy. So I just used my utility knife to cut that off like you can see me doing here. And I ended up just using the pick your own part, and the piece of wood ended up being 3 inches by 1 inch. Then I wanted to make another little sign. So with one of these scrap popsicle stick pieces that I had left over, I had painted that with a plaster color, and then with a pen, I'm just writing apples 5 cents on it. And then I wanted to have it on a little stake, and I had one of these little wood pieces from the Dollar Tree assorted wood pack. I quickly painted this with the plaster color, and then I just hot glued the apple little sign to the wood stake. Next, I am just going to start assembling more things together. I am hot gluing my little apple box on the right hand side of my crate, and then I hot glued the apple 5 cent sign right over top of where I had placed the apples. I then hot glued each one of my apple cider bottles on the left side of my crate, and then I thought it would be really cute to add some faux donuts. So I'm using these mini wood beads from Dollar Tree, and I'm just going to be painting them. I'm using the River Walk color from Folk Art. Again, I'm using one of these little mini wood stakes, and it's perfect to add a bead on the end of it so you can paint it without getting your fingers all painted over. So once I have those all painted, I'm going to be creating another little mini sign with one of the popsicle sticks that I had left over, and I'm just writing donuts 10 cents on this one. And then I'm going to be hot gluing each one of my donuts right in front of my apple cider bottles. And I did 3. I did 2 donuts next to each other and then 1 on top. And then I added my little pick your own sign right in the center of my wood crates. And then after that, I added the donuts 10 cents on the left hand side of the crate right underneath the donuts. Next, I'm taking one of these birch wood pieces from Dollar Tree, and I'm hot gluing it to the left hand side of the front of my crate. And then I'm going to be using my 3 leftover mini apples that I have, and I'm hot gluing them on the very top of the birch wood piece. Then to add some detail to my pick your own sign, I'm using the red and white checked cardstock once again. I'm just measuring it to the length that it will fit on the top and bottom of my sign. And then I'm just painting on a little bit of Mod Podge on the top of the sign and then just gluing on the cardstock. And again, I did the same thing to the bottom. I just cut the cardstock down to size, used some Mod Podge, and then placed the cardstock over top to attach it. I thought it'd be really cute to add some corn stalks to this piece, so I'm using some Raphia from Dollar Tree, and I'm just taking several pieces of it all together and then just cutting it down to the length that I want. I did try to use the pieces that were a little bit thicker, and then I took just another strand of Raphia and I wrapped it around the center of all of the ones that I have bunched together and then just tied it really tight to create my cord stalk. I then trimmed it up a little bit with my scissors and then hot glued this one on the right hand side of the front of my crates. After I had this cornstalk all created and on, I thought I needed to add a second one. So what I ended up doing was just creating another one, but the little birch wood piece that I have already attached, I peeled that off, put the cornstalk on, and then I re-glued my donut sign and then also my birch wood piece over top of the cornstalk. And this is what my mini apple stand looks like all finished. I love this one so much. This is by far my favorite project from today's video. I had so much fun creating it. It did take a little bit of extra time on this one, but I think it is so worth it, and I really hope that you enjoy this one as well. Now moving into DIY number 4. For this project today, I'm going to be using this apple picture frame from Dollar Tree, and I am first starting out by removing the center wood piece of the frame and then just removing it, and then I'm painting the outside portion of my apple with that color that I've been creating today with the Tuscan red and the Imperial colors from Folk Art. I just mixed them together to create this really deep red, and I only had to do one coat of paint. Then for the leaf of the apple, I'm doing this one in Spanish moss, and then the stem of the apple I'm doing in the color raw sienna. Then for the inside wood circle that I removed, I'm painting that with my plaster colored paint. For this project, I'm also going to be using one of these wood planks from Dollar Tree. I have cut this one down as well, and it is 4.5 by 3 inches, and I'm painting this with that plaster paint as well. Then once the paint was dry on my circle, I have created this apple cider served fresh daily sign on my Cricut. I will have it linked down in the description box if you're interested in the download. And then I'm just getting it transferred right in the center of my circle. And then it did have a little line, but it looked kind of wonky. So I ended up just removing it and then using a pen to create 2 lines. I'm just using this little wood plank piece that I had to make sure that I have a straight line, and like I said, I did 2 lines instead of 1, and I ended up really liking the look of it. Next, I'm placing hot glue around the back side of my circle and then just placing it right in the center of my apple to attach it. Then I wanted to have a little bit of distressing on the centerpiece, so I'm using some of my Java colored chalk paint, and I'm just dry brushing that all around the edges of the circle and then a little bit on the front of the circle as well around all of the vinyl. I'm taking some of this burlap ribbon and just cutting a strip of it out, and then I'm cutting that strip in half because I need to have a thinner piece of this burlap ribbon. I'm then taking it and wrapping it around the back side of the apple, and then the 2 front pieces I'm just crisscrossing around each other, and then I'm hot gluing those into place so that they don't move around. I'm also going to be using this green and cream color checked ribbon. This is from Hobby Lobby, but I know that Dollar Tree has similar ribbon. I'm just wrapping that around the burlap ribbon at the very top, and then I'm just making a really simple bow, cutting off the ends of both of my ribbons, and then I'm just making sure to hot glue my green ribbon into place. Then I'm taking another strip of this burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree. I'm cutting it pretty thin. I would say it's about 1 inch in thickness, and then I'm just going to be measuring that out to the same length that my wood plank piece is, and then I'm taking that piece of ribbon and just hot gluing it in the center of my wood plank. Now, I only had 1 piece on, and then I thought it needed to be a little bit thicker. I cut it too thin, so I ended up just adding another piece like you can see me doing here, and then I'm hot gluing my apple right in the center of my wood plank, right over top of that burlap ribbon. But then my apple didn't want to stay up, so I'm using 3 of these tumbling tower blocks from Dollar Tree. I'm hot gluing all of them together, and then I'm hot gluing those right behind my apple, and that is just gonna make my apple stay up without falling over. And this is what my apple cider sign looks like all finished. It was another really easy project that turned out super cute. For the first DIY today, I'm going to be starting with this 5-inch unfinished wood square block, and this one did come from Michael's, and it's from the Make Market brand. I first started painting it with my Pueblo colored paint, but I ended up not liking it, so I'm just going to be painting over it here with my Folk Art matte acrylic paint and the color Yellow Ochre. To give the edges of my block a little bit of a distressed look, I used a little bit of this dark brown paint around all of the edges. The color I'm using is from Folk Art and the color Burnt Umber. Next, I'm going to be using this 3-inch unfinished wood square. These you can pretty much get at any craft store. And here I'm just going to be staining mine with my Folk Art wood tint in the color Walnut. Then I'm going to be using hot glue on the back side to attach it to the center of my yellow colored block. I'm going to be using these Hello Autumn wood word cutouts. These I did cut out myself on my X-Tool M1 machine, but if you don't have a machine like that to cut out your own words, they have so many out in craft stores right now for fall, so you can probably get some really great fall words from there. The one I am using here for the SVG file, I did purchase from Etsy, and I will have a link to that down in my description box. I am going to be painting both words Hello and Autumn with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. Another little detail piece that I'm going to be using are one of these wood leaves. I think these are so cute, and I just recently picked them up from Joann Fabrics. I just took one of the leaves off of the wire that it was attached to, and then here I'm just getting everything lined up where I want it to be before I start gluing everything down. And as you can see here, I used hot glue to attach everything. Then for the last little detail piece, I used about 2 strands of a raffia and just created a really simple small bow. I thought it would be a really cute detail to add to the bottom of my leaf. So once I have my little raffia bow made, I just cut off the long ends and then attached the bow on top of the leaf using some hot glue. Here's the piece all finished. This one was super easy to do, and it is the perfect accent piece because you can pretty much put it anywhere, a table, a tiered tray, a shelf. It's just the perfect size. Next up is DIY number 2. For this one, I'm going to be starting with these 2 wooden hoops, and these ones are both from Dollar Tree. And the first thing I'm doing is staining both of the hoops with my Folk Art wood tint in the color Walnut. I'm then using hot glue on the bottom of the smaller hoop and attaching it on the inside of the larger hoop. Next, I'm going to be using this scrap piece of wood that's 5.5 inches in length, and I'm going to be using that same walnut colored wood tint to stain this entire piece. For some of the florals I'm going to be using are these orangish color ones here, and they are from Hobby Lobby. They're about $2.99 a piece, and then I always get them when they're 40% off. I'm cutting them off of their stems, and then I'm going to be hot gluing one on the left side and then one on the right side. And then once I have those added, like you can see here, I'm gonna add 2 more. So these ones are just gonna be overlapping the first ones that I had attached, again on the right and left side. Then to add some dimension, I'm going to be using this cream color one. It's the same pick as the last ones, only in a different color. And I'm just going to be cutting small pieces of the stems, and I'm going to be hot gluing them in the middle of the pieces that I just added, just to give this wreath a little bit of dimension. And I really love these 2 colors together. I thought it would be super cute if I added some of these white berries. These are from Hobby Lobby and came from this pick here. I ended up just cutting 2 bundles of the berries off, and I'm going to be using one on each side of the wreath, just kind of hot glued in the center of those other colors. Then to add even more dimension, I thought it would be really cute to add some of these corn stalks. The corn stalks I got also from Hobby Lobby, and I'm just taking a strip of the corn stalk and then just tearing it. And I did sections of 3. So I did 3 little strips together, and then I would twist the very bottom so that they would stick together, so you kind of have like 3 in 1. And then I just flipped my wreath over and hot glued that little bundle right on the back side, and I did the exact same thing for the other side of the wreath as well. Next, I wanted to add this thankful wooden word cutout, and this one is from Hobby Lobby, and I'm going to be painting this with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. This did come in a pack with a couple different fall unfinished wood words, and then once I have it painted, I'm just using some hot glue so that I can attach it across the smaller hoop here in the center. And then I'm going to be using hot glue on the bottom of my hoops and just attaching it on my wooden piece. I'm also going to be adding some of this pumpkin ribbon from Hobby Lobby. I'm just creating a really simple bow here, and then I did want the tail ends of my bow to be in a V shape, so here I'm just cutting them into a V, and then I'm hot gluing my bow right in the center of the top of my wreath. For the very last step, I'm going to be using some of these pumpkin pine cones. These ones are from Dollar Tree. I just use one of the orange small pumpkins, and I'm hot gluing that right in the center of the hoops on the bottom of the little stand that I have. And then I'm hot gluing 2 pine cones on each side of that pumpkin. And here is the standing wreath all finished. I think this one is super cute. And what I love most about this one is it's a little bit different than your average wreath. Next up is DIY number 3. For this one, I'm going to be using this unfinished wood coaster set. This came from Hobby Lobby. It's $6.99 regular price, but I got it when it was 40% off, so a really good price for unfinished wood. The first thing I'm going to be doing is just staining the entire base piece here with my folk art tint, wood tint in the color walnut. No surprise there, it's my favorite. And then once I have the base all stained, I'm then going to be staining all 6 of these round coasters with that same wood tint. For all 6 of the coasters, I am going to be using these mini fall themed stencils. These ones I did pick up from Amazon, and I will have a link to them down in my description box. I just think that they are so cute, and again, they're the perfect size for the coasters. So what I did is just took the stencil and placed it right in the center of my round coaster. And what I like to do is use painter's tape around all 4 sides of the stencil just to hold it in place so it doesn't move around while I'm painting. For the paint, I'm going to be using Waverly's chalk paint in the color Ivory, and I'm just using a medium-sized stencil brush to apply the paint. After the paint was all dry, I then removed all of the painter's tape and the stencil. And then I did the same steps for the next 5 remaining coasters, obviously with different stencils, and I just used that same Waverly paint in Ivory as well. Since these are coasters, I wanted to make sure to add a sealer to the top of them, and the sealer that I used is the Rust-Oleum Matte Clear Enamel Sealer. I did 3 coats of this to make sure that they're all nice and sealed and ready to use. These are what the coasters look like all finished. I think that they turned out absolutely beautiful, and they were really easy and inexpensive to create. Moving right along into DIY number 4. For this one, I'm going to be using this sign that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. It was on clearance for $4.49, and I just wanted to make it over since it has really good bones to it. It has a really nice thick frame, only I wanted to darken it up a bit. So here, you probably guessed it, I'm using my folk art wood tint in the color walnut to stain the entire frame. Then for the inside of the sign, I wanted to have a really fun fall color, so I'm painting it in the folk art matte acrylic paint in yellow ochre, and I did have to do a couple different coats of this paint to cover up those words. Then I wanted to give the inside wood slats a little bit of distressing, so I'm using the Folk Art paint in the color Burnt Umber, and I'm just dry brushing that on all of the inside little edges. Next, I'm going to be using these unfinished wood letters from Hobby Lobby. This one you can see spells out the word apples, but I'm also going to be spelling out the word flannels, cider, pumpkins, leaves, and hay rides for all of the words and letters. I'm painting each one with my Waverly chalk paint in the color ivory. Once I have all of the letters painted, I have the words all created in all of their spaces, getting them exactly where I want them to be, and then I'm going to go through and hot glue each one of the letters down. Here's what the sign looks like all finished. I really love how this one turned out. I love the really bright colors, and it fits perfect with my fall decor this year. Now for the fifth and final DIY for today, I'm going to be starting with one of these 5-inch square unfinished wood blocks from Michaels, and I'm going to be using my favorite wood tint in walnut to stain the entire piece. I'm then going to be using a sheet of this pumpkin printed craft paper from Hobby Lobby, and since I need to measure it down to size, I'm just going to be placing the wood block on the back side of my paper, and then I'm just going to be tracing around it with a marker. I am going to be doing it a little bit larger than the wood block so that I have a little bit of extra paper to fold over the edges. Once I had it all measured and traced out, I then just cut it out with some scissors. I'm then using some Mod Podge on the wood and just spreading that out with a brush. I did end up using a little bit too much glue, but it's better than not enough. Then once I had the glue on, I placed my paper right over top and then just smoothed out any bubbles. After the glue dried down a bit, I just used some sandpaper and started sanding the paper around all of the edges of my wood, and it just gives you a really nice, clean, crisp cut. Then I'm going to be using these wood trim pieces. You can get this at Lowe's, and I already cut mine down to fit around the entire outside edge of my square. And then here, I'm just using that walnut wood tint to give them all a nice stained look. I'm then using hot glue to attach all of the wood trim pieces. The two longer ones are going to be on the top and the bottom, and then the two shorter ones are going to be my side pieces. I'm going to be using this Hello wood word cutout. This one I did cut out myself on my Xtool M1 machine, and it is an SVG cut file that I did purchase on Etsy, and I'll have a link to that down in my description box. But you can also buy these Hello wood word cutouts at pretty much any craft store, and then also I cut out these letters to spell out pumpkin. You can buy individual letters at your local craft store as well if you cannot cut them out. And again, I'll have a link to the Etsy shop that I purchased the SVG files from. For the hello word and then all of the letters to spell out pumpkin, I am using my walnut wood tint. For the very last step, I'm just using some hot glue to attach my hello and pumpkin word right in the center of my sign. And here is the sign all finished. I really love how simple this one is. And again, it was super easy and inexpensive. For the first DIY today, I'm going to be using 3 pieces of wood that are 19 inches by 2.5 inches. I usually buy all of my wood from either Lowe's or Home Depot. The first thing I'm doing is taking my Folk Art wood tint in the color Walnut, and I'm painting it on my pieces of wood in sections, and then once I have it all painted on, I use an old rag to wipe away the excess wood tint, and again, I did that for all 3 pieces of wood. I'm also going to be using 2 smaller pieces of wood. These ones are 7.5 inches by 1.5 inches, and I'm doing the same thing, just using that wood tint in Walnut. I'm painting it on and then wiping away the excess with an old rag. Next, I'm using hot glue on the sides of all 3 of my larger pieces of wood to hold them together. And then once I have them attached, I'm then going to be placing my 2 smaller pieces of wood on top. And then before I attach those down, I am going to be using this Welcome to Our Patch stencil. This is from Amazon, and I will have it linked down in the description box. But I get the stencil centered where I want it to be, and then I start moving my smaller pieces of wood around, and I am using a measuring tape just to make sure that I have them spaced out exactly the same on both sides. And once I have them all spaced where I want them to be, I'm using hot glue on the bottom just to get them attached to the top pieces or the bottom pieces of wood. Then to keep my stencil from moving around, I'm using some painter's tape at the top and bottom just to keep it nice and straight. Then for my words, welcome to our patch, I'm using my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. And I was gonna do the entire piece in white, but then I decided to do the pumpkin a different color. So I'm just gonna be using some painter's tape over top of the pumpkin so that I don't get any of the white colored paint on the pumpkin. Once I have all of the words painted, I then peel the painter's tape off of the pumpkin and then just use that same tape over the words so that I don't get the pumpkin color on my words. Then for the pumpkin color, I'm using Folk Art matte acrylic paint in the color Pueblo. And then once the pumpkin paint was dry, I took some more painter's tape and placed it over top of the pumpkin because I'm doing the stem of the pumpkin in a different color. And the color I'm using for that is Folk Art chalk paint in the color Sage Shadow. Then after all of my paint was dry, I removed all of my painter's tape and my stencil. Since this is going to be a serving tray, I'm using these two handles. These ones are either from Home Depot or Lowe's, I can't remember. But I'm just using my measuring tape to make sure that I have them centered on my top pieces of wood. Once I have them all centered, I'm just moving them over a little bit and placing hot glue on the bottoms to attach them. And I did the exact same thing for the other side. And this is the tray all finished. This was such an easy project and it looks so high end and it was really inexpensive to create. I do recommend using a clear sealer over top just to make sure everything stays nice and protected. Moving right along into DIY number 2. For this one, I'm using this large papier-mâché pumpkin. This I did pick up from Hobby Lobby this year. And I'm first going to be taking some of these dot stickers. These are from Dollar Tree. And the only ones that I could find are these pink ones. But I do think they have like a pearl color that you can buy as well. So I do recommend getting the white color if you are going to be painting your pumpkin white. For this one, I'm just going to be taking the pink stickers and placing them in all of the grooves of the pumpkin. The little strips of the dots were not long enough to go all the way down, so I did have to do several strips. As you can see, I would just cut the little bead off until there was like a little strip showing, like you can see here, and then I would continue placing it next to the other dot, and it looked really seamless and you couldn't even tell that it was more than one strip. And I just continued to do that over and over in all of the grooves of the pumpkin until I had them all covered with the dots. After I had all of the dots on, then I'm going to be going in with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I'm painting over the pink dots first because I'm going to have to do several coats of this paint over top just to get that pink color all covered up. I did do 4 coats on the dots, and then the rest of the pumpkin I only had to do 2 coats of this paint. Then once the paint was dry, I moved on to the stem, and for the stem of the pumpkin, I'm using the Folk Art matte acrylic paint in the color Raw Sienna. I wanted to add a little bit more detail and dimension to my pumpkin, so I'm using my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Java, and I'm dry brushing this color over top of all of those dots that I added to all of the grooves of the pumpkin. This is just gonna really make those dots pop. So I did that and it was kind of messy. I wanted this to look rustic and kind of old. So once I had the dots all covered up with this paint, I decided to use this same Java color and add a little bit of detail to the stem of the pumpkin to make it look a little bit more realistic. I then thought the pumpkin needed even more detail, so I took that same Java color and whatever was left over on my brush, and I just very lightly painted it on the rest of the pumpkin. And since this is a papier-mâché pumpkin, it did have a lot of little like crevices and grooves, and once I put that Java color over top, it really made those pop and it almost looked like the pumpkin was wood. Then I decided to add a second color. So for this one, I'm using that same raw sienna color that I used for the stem. I'm using a little bit less of this color than I did the Java color, and I'm just very lightly painting that again over all of the dots that I had added in the grooves, and then just a little bit on the other parts of the pumpkin. Next, I'm using some hot glue to attach Spanish moss all the way around my stem on the very top of my pumpkin. I'm also going to be using this Grateful faux leather tag from Hobby Lobby. I'm placing it around the stem of the pumpkin, and then to keep it in place, I'm using a little bit of hot glue underneath just to make sure that it doesn't move around. And then I'm also going to be using this leaf. This came from Dollar Tree from one of the fall stems. I used some hot glue to attach that right next to the Grateful tag, and then I added some of these mini pine cones that I believe are from Dollar Tree. They were in my craft stash, but I'm almost certain that Dollar Tree has the mini pine cones. And then I'm using some of these yellow florals, and I believe these ones are from Hobby Lobby. I just cut them down really short and then attached them behind my leaf, and then to hold it into place I ended up adding a little bit more Spanish moss just so that it sits up a little bit, and then I use one of these little acorns right in the center in between two pine cones. And this is what the pumpkin looks like all finished. I love how this turned out. It fits perfect with my fall decor. You could do this pumpkin in so many different styles and different colors to make it fit with your own home decor. Today's projects for DIY number 3. For this one, I'm using this bead wreath form from Hobby Lobby, and I'm also going to be using these fall eucalyptus stems from Hobby Lobby, and then these other fall stems from Hobby Lobby. This one usually has a white pumpkin attached to this piece, but I've already used the pumpkin on another project. The first thing I'm doing is starting with the eucalyptus stems. I'm using some pliers to cut 2 pieces off of the stems. Then I'm going to be using one on each side of the wreath. And then for the other fall stems, I'm just cutting off the raffia parts, and then I'm also going to be cutting off the little white berries that are on this piece as well. Then I'm taking the raffia and I'm using some hot glue to attach it to the bottom beads of the wreath form. And then I'm taking one of the eucalyptus stems and I'm going to be hot gluing that right over top of the raffia stem. But to hold it into place, I ended up taking a piece of jute and then just wrapping it around a couple times and tying it off so that those pieces would stay in place until the glue fully set. Then I did the exact same thing to the other side, just going in the opposite direction. I first hot glued the raffia stem down to the beads first, then the eucalyptus stem over top of the raffia, and then I took that piece of jute, wrapped it around the stems and the beads, and just tied that off to hold them into place until the glue fully set. Then I'm cutting off some of these white berries that were on the fall stems from Hobby Lobby. I'm cutting off 2 of them, one for each side of the bottom of my wreath. Then I'm also going to be using one of these pumpkins. These did come from the floral section at Hobby Lobby, but I ended up just using one of them for this project, and then I just cut the stem of it off. I'm also using this fall stem. This is also from Hobby Lobby. You can pick this one up in the fall picks at Hobby Lobby. I'm using 2 of them. I'm hot gluing this piece right over top of the raffia and the eucalyptus stem, just holding that into place until the glue sets. And of course, I did the exact same thing to the other side. Now I'm finally attaching those white berries that I cut off just a little while ago, and I'm hot gluing those right next to the fall stems that I just previously attached. Next, I'm attaching my pumpkin. I'm placing hot glue on the bottom of my pumpkin and then placing it in between all of the fall stems that I've attached to my wreath. Again, holding that into place until the glue is fully dry. I'm then adding some of these mini pine cones from Dollar Tree around my pumpkin. I'm now attaching some Spanish moss around both sides of my pumpkin. Once I have the moss all added, I did go back through and add a few more of the mini pine cones around the Spanish moss. And instead of having my wreath where all of the florals are on the bottom, I really like the look where all of the florals are going to be on the left side. So I just shaped my florals a little bit so that they would go around the side of the wreath. This is what it looks like all finished. I think it is absolutely beautiful. I love all of these colors together. And what's even better is this wreath only took me a few minutes to create. Next is a DIY number 4. For this one, I'm going to be using 2 scrap pieces of wood. These ones are 14 inches by 3.5 inches. And the first thing I'm doing to these ones is painting both of them with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I did 2 coats of paint on both pieces of wood. Then I'm going to be using 4 pieces of trim. This trim I did pick up from Lowe's and I've already cut it down. The longer pieces are 14 by 1/2 of an inch, and then the shorter pieces are 6 inches by 1/2 of an inch. I'm taking my Folk Art wood tint in the color Walnut and I'm painting this color on the trim in sections, and then once I would have the tint all painted on, I would use an old rag to wipe away the excess, and I did this on all 4 pieces of my trim. To hold the 2 pieces of wood together that I've painted in the plaster color, I am going to be using 4 popsicle sticks from Dollar Tree. I used hot glue on the popsicle sticks and then just attached those in between the 2 wood pieces. Again, I used 4 of them, and this is just making sure that my 2 plaster color pieces are going to stay together. Next, I'm using the trim pieces that I've stained, and I'm just going to be framing my wood pieces that I've painted in the plaster color. I'm placing the trim exactly where I want it to be so that it's all set before I start attaching it. To attach it, I am using hot glue. I just lifted up the pieces a little bit, placed the hot glue on the back side, and then just pressed the trim back down into place. And I did that for all 4 of my trim pieces. For this project, I'm going to be using these unfinished wood letters. These ones are from Hobby Lobby, and I'm spelling out the word hello. For the paint color that I'm using, it's in the color Pueblo, again from Folk Art, and it is the matte acrylic paint. I did all of the letters this color, and then I'm also going to be using this pumpkin wood word cutout. This one is from Michaels. It comes in a pack that says Hello Pumpkin, but I am only going to be using the pumpkin lettering from the pack because I really didn't care for the hello word. So once I have them all painted and the paint is dry, I am just going to be spacing them out the way I want all of my letters and my words to be, and then I'm going to be using hot glue on the back side to attach them. You will notice here in just a second, I didn't have my pumpkin word placed exactly where I wanted it to be, and the glue set too quickly, and I ended up breaking my middle P. But I just painted over it a little bit, hoping that you won't be able to notice it too much, but it ended up looking okay. But just be careful not to break your letters like I did. Once I had the pumpkin word all on, I did go back through and use hot glue on the back side of all of my wood letters to spell out the word hello. Then for the last step, I am going to be using this orange and cream color checked ribbon from Hobby Lobby with 2 pieces of jute. I cut them down to the size that I'm going to want my hanger to be for my sign, and then I just used a staple gun to attach the jute and the ribbon to the back side of my sign. And this is what the Hello Pumpkin sign looks like all finished. This one to me looks like you could go and purchase this in a retail store, minus the broken P. But I really love how this one turned out, and it only took me a little bit to create it, and it was really inexpensive. Now moving into DIY number 5. This is the last DIY in today's video, and I'm starting with this sunflower paper. This is from Hobby Lobby, and I'm also using this house cutout. This one is from Dollar Tree, and I'm taking my paper and placing it over the front of my house, and I just started to sketch out where I'm going to need to cut my paper out. But once I started like sketching it out, I realized I could just press down a little bit on the paper and it would make a little crease, and then I would be able to just use that as a guide when I'm cutting the paper. So here I'm just cutting the house shape on my paper, and then once I have that all cut out, I'm using some Mod Podge, and I'm just using a paintbrush to paint that Mod Podge on the back side of the paper, and then I'm placing it on the inside of my house dry erase board, and then just pressing that paper down and getting out any little creases and bubbles that are underneath. Next, I'm painting the frame of my house with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I probably should have done this part before I added the paper on the inside of the dry erase, but I didn't, so I just had to be very careful when painting around the inside of the frame. And then I'm taking this little square wood cutout. This one was a wood plank from Dollar Tree, and I ended up just cutting it to the size that is 3 inches by 3 inches. And then I painted it with the Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I'm also using this Fall Sweet Fall mini stencil from Amazon, and I will have the link to it down in the description box. I got the stencil all centered on my little piece of wood, and then I used painter's tape around the edges to hold the stencil into place so that it wouldn't move around once I start painting. For the paint color, I'm using my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Java, and I painted the entire words and leaves in this color. Then once the paint was all dry, I'm removing the painter's tape and the stencil from my wood piece. And this is what it looks like all painted. Now I'm moving on, and I'm using some of this wood bead trim. This I did pick up from Hobby Lobby, and I always like to get this when it's 50% off. What I'm doing now is just taking the wood beads, and I'm just stringing them along the very top roof of the house just to see how much I need before I cut the beads. And then I'm just going to be removing a few of them so I have a little bit of that string hanging out so I can tie a knot just to make sure that the beads stay all together. And then I'm using some of that wood tint in the color Walnut that I had left over on my rag from previous projects. And I'm just wiping that on the beads to give them a little bit more of a darker color. Then I'm going to be attaching the beads to the very top roof frame, and I'm using some hot glue to attach them. And I just made sure that they were really tight as I was hot gluing them down, and then I'm going to be having them go along the roof frame, and then like where the frame of the house would meet the bottom of the house, I just had that strung across, and it, like I did with the rest, I just hot glued it to make sure that it stayed in place. Then I attached the 3x3 that I used my stencil on and just placed it at the bottom portion in the center of my house shape. And then to go around my 3x3 piece, I used some jute, and I just used some hot glue to attach the jute around all 4 sides. Another piece I'm going to be using for this project is this mini Raphia bow. This did come in a pack in the fall section at Hobby Lobby this year. And then I'm using some of these little sunflowers. These ones I believe are from Dollar Tree last year. And I'm taking one of the sunflowers, I cut the stem off, and then I'm just hot gluing that right over the bead that was on the Raphia bow. And then I'm hot gluing that right in the center of the beads at the top of my house. And then I added 2 more of those sunflowers on each side of my house. And this is what my piece looks like all finished. Another really easy project, and I just love this yellow color for fall. For the first project today, I'm going to be creating a pumpkin tic-tac-toe. And I'm first starting with these 4 wooden beads, and they are flat at the top and bottom. These are going to be the feet for my tic-tac-toe board. And the first thing I'm doing is just painting on my Folk Art wood tint in the color Walnut. Once I had the wood tint all painted on, then I just wiped away the excess with a rag. Next, I'm going to be using that same wood tint on this wood piece. This came with a bunch of different little wooden icons in it, and I always save these because I end up using them for projects later on. I did the same thing. I just painted the wood tint on, and then any excess I would just wipe away with a rag, and I did work in small sections when doing this. I'm also going to be using 9 of these unfinished wooden pumpkins from Hobby Lobby. 5 of them I'm going to be painting with my Folk Art acrylic matte paint in the color Pueblo, and then I'm going to be painting the remaining 4 of the pumpkins with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. Then for the stems on all 9 of my pumpkins, I'm using the color Raw Sienna, and it is from Folk Art, and it is a matte acrylic paint. Next, I'm getting my wood beads placed exactly where I want them to be before I start attaching them, and then to attach them, I'm using hot glue. You could leave it just like this once the feet are attached and just have your tic-tac board as is, but I wanted to dress up the pumpkins a little bit, so I took some jewelry wire and I just wrapped it around the stem of one of the pumpkins, and then I removed it and used a really small paintbrush handle, and I just wrapped that wire around the handle just to make little like curly cues with the wire, and I did that on each side of the wire. And this is going to be like the little tendrils of the pumpkin. So once I have those all done up, I just placed it back onto the pumpkin stem, and then I did want to add a little bit more detail, so I took some leftover fall stems that I had from Hobby Lobby. I cut them down very small, and then I just hot glued a small piece of that right on the top of my pumpkin. And I added that same detail for the remaining 8 pumpkins. And this is what my tic-tac-toe board looks like all finished. It is mini, so it's perfect for a small tabletop decor piece for this fall. It was super easy to do, and I love the way that it turned out. Now moving into DIY number 2. For this one, I'm using this wooden block. This is from Hobby Lobby, and it's about 4 inches by 2.5 inches. I'm also using a couple of these wood strips, also from Hobby Lobby, and I've already cut them down so that they will be framed around my wood block. Then for the strips, I'm using my Folk Art wood tin in the color Walnut. I'm painting the wood tin on and then just wiping away the excess with a rag like I always do, and I did this for all 4 of the strips. Then I painted my wood block with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I only had to do 1 coat of this paint. Once the paint was dry, I then started attaching all of the wood strips around the edges of my blocks to form what will look like a frame. Now that I have my frame attached, I am going to be using this Thankful pumpkin stencil. This is from Amazon, and I will have it linked down in my description box. It is a little bit too large for me to place inside of the frame, so I just cut the stencil down a little bit. I got it centered where I want it to be, and then so that it doesn't move around, I'm just using some painter's tape around all of the edges to hold it into place for when I'm painting. Then for the word thankful, I'm using the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Rich Black. Then for the pumpkin color that I'm using on my stencil, it's from Folk Art. It is a matte acrylic paint in the color Pueblo. Then for the greenery, I'm using Sage Shadow from Folk Art, and then the stem of my pumpkin is in Raw Sienna, also from Folk Art. I let the paint completely dry before removing the painter's tape and my stencil, and then I did want to add just one more little detail. So I took a piece of raffia along with a piece of jute, and I just tied them together in a bow, cut down the bow a little bit, and then I hot glued that on the right hand side of my frame. And this is what the piece looks like all finished. Another really easy, affordable piece, and it is the perfect size for a tiered tray. Now moving right along into DIY number 3. For this one, I'm going to be making over one of these. Well, I did 2 of them, but I'm just going to be showing you one. It's a Dollar Tree pumpkin that I just recently picked up, and it has these cute little thankful tags on them. And the pumpkins are nice the way they are, but I wanted to jazz them up a little bit. So I first started by just removing the stems of the pumpkin, and then I took off the little thankful tag because I am going to be using that, but I will not be reusing the plastic stems. Next, I'm taking 2 strands of jute and I'm tying them together with a knot just so that they will stay together when I'm working with them. And then I'm taking some hot glue and placing it at the very top and the inside of my pumpkin, placing the jute over the glue to attach it, and then pulling those jute pieces around the pumpkin and up through the other seam of the pumpkin on the other side, hot gluing that at the very top and then just cutting off the jute that was left over. I'm then doing that same step, tying 2 more pieces of jute together and just hot gluing them at the very top of the pumpkin, wrapping those around the seams of the pumpkin like you can see me doing here. And then when I pull them up on the other side, I'm just securing it with more hot glue and cutting off the jute. I then just continued that on all of the seams that were on this pumpkin. And then for the stem of my pumpkin, I'm going to be using this small piece of a branch that's already been cut down. I'm then placing hot glue on the inside of the pumpkin, and then the stem goes inside of the pumpkin right over top of that glue to hold it into place. And then I wanted to add a little bit of detail to this piece. So I'm taking some of these fall stems from Hobby Lobby, and these ones have already been cut down, and this is just like extra that I had in my stash. I'm cutting them down pretty small, and then once I have my pieces all separated, I'm going to be hot gluing them around the stem on top of my pumpkin. Next, I'm taking the little thankful tag that was originally on the pumpkin and I'm wrapping it around the stem, and then just to make sure that it stays into place, I am going to be securing it with some hot glue. And then I did end up adding even more of those little fall stems from Hobby Lobby around the tag. And this is what the made over Dollar Tree pumpkin looks like. It was cute when I first got it, but by adding just a few little changes, it fits so much better with my decor, and I think it looks a lot more high-end this way as well. Next up is DIY number 4. For this project, I'm using one of these glass jars from Hobby Lobby, and the first thing I'm doing is just removing the lid on the jar. I am not going to be using this for this project, so I'm just going to be setting that aside for another project. And then I'm using some of my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I painted this color on my jar, and I did do 2 coats of this paint. Then I wanted to add some distressing to my jar, so I'm using my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Castle, and I'm dry brushing this color horizontally on my entire jar. Then I'm going to be taking this wheat bundle from Hobby Lobby, and I did have to bend up the stems a little bit so that they would fit inside of my jar. And then once they're placed in my jar, I ended up using some of these corn stalks. These are also from Hobby Lobby, and I'm just breaking them down a little bit so that they are in thinner strips. I'm then placing those corn stalk strips around all of the wheat. I'm adding some of these yellow florals as well. I believe these ones are a wheat as well. These were just in my craft stash that I've had for a while, and I'm placing them around the other wheat that I got from Hobby Lobby. And then I did want to add a little bit more color to my jar, so I ended up taking my Java color from Folk Art and I dry brushed that right over top of the Castle color on my jar just to give it a little bit more dimension. I'm then adding this faux leather thankful leaf. This did come from Dollar Tree. I'm wrapping it around the top of my jar, and then I just tied it in a knot and secured it with some hot glue. And this is the piece all finished, a really easy project that's perfect for tabletop or shelf decor this fall. Next up is DIY number 5. For this one, I'm going to be making a pillow, and for this I'm using 2 of these placemats from Dollar General. Don't mind my puppy, she wanted to help out. And I'm also using this Fall is in the Air stencil from Amazon, and I will have it linked down below. I placed my stencil in the middle of one of my placemats, and then I just used painter's tapes to secure it down. Then for the paint color, I'm using my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Rich Black. And anytime that I'm stenciling on any kind of fabric, I always make sure that I use very small amounts of paint. I always just build the paint color up, and that prevents any bleeding underneath. I'm letting the paint completely dry before removing the tape and the stencil. I'm then taking the first placemat and I'm putting that down with the back of the placemat facing up, and then I'm placing the one that I just stenciled on down on top of that. I'm making sure that all of the lines on the placemats are even and exactly in the same spot, and then I'm taking some hot glue and I'm starting to just glue those two placemats together. You could use a fabric glue if you wanted to. I'm just using hot glue today. Or you could also sew these together if you are good at sewing. I personally am not, so I'm just using some hot glue today. So I did 3 sides glued together, and then one of the ends I left open, and that is where I'm going to be filling with polyfill. You can get polyfill at any craft store, or you can even buy it from places like Walmart as well, or Amazon. So I'm just stuffing my pillow to my desired stuffiness, which I do like a pretty full pillow, so I'm using a pretty good amount of polyfill. And then once I get to where I'm going to be gluing the end of this pillow up, I just place a little bit of polyfill right at the end, and then I glue it together, and then I just keep doing that. I add a little bit more polyfill so that that very end where I'm gluing right now is going to have a pretty good amount of stuffing. So again, just fill a little bit, glue a little bit, fill a little bit, glue a little bit until that entire end is all glued up. This is what my pillow looks like all finished. I think it turned out super cute, and you could do this with so many different colors and kinds of placemats and make your own custom pillows for so much less than what you would pay in store. Now moving right along into the 6th and final DIY for today, I'm using this sign from Dollar Tree where I've already peeled off one of the pieces to it, but I am going to be popping off this little heart shape as well because I'm not going to be using it for this project. Then I'm going to be using some of my matte acrylic paint from Folk Art in the color Pueblo, and I only did 1 coat of this paint. I'm then taking this scrap piece of burlap and I'm just pushing it down inside of this piece, and then I'm using a pen to kind of mark around where I need to cut my burlap to fit inside of this piece. Now that I have my burlap all marked, I'm just using some scissors to cut out the burlap, and then I'm using hot glue on the inside to secure my burlap. Then I wanted to add some detail on the inside, so I'm hot gluing cotton cord that I picked up from Hobby Lobby around the entire inside edge. And to secure it, again, like I said, I'm using some hot glue. Once I get around all 4 of the sides, I just cut the cotton cord and then hot glue the end piece down. I did want to add a little bit of distressing, so I used my Waverly paint and plaster and just really messily painted this around all of the edges of the frame of this piece. And then I'm going to be attaching this Welcome to Our Patch little piece that I picked up from the Target dollar spot this year. I'm using some hot glue on the back side of it and then just making sure I have it centered when I press it into the inside of the piece from Dollar Tree. I am going to add one of these little raffia bows with a button from Hobby Lobby at the top left-hand corner of my frame. And this is the tabletop sign all finished. I think it is so cute and rustic. Again, a really easy project. For the first DIY today, I'm going to be creating fabric pumpkins. This is the fabric I'm going to be using. It's this really pretty plaid fabric from Hobby Lobby. I'm loving the burnt orange color for fall this year. And I'm also going to be using this wood pumpkin just to use as a guide to trace around on my fabric. If you don't have a pumpkin shape like this that you can use to trace, you can always just print one from the internet and use that. So I'm just getting it all set up on my fabric, and then I'm using a marker to trace around the pumpkin. I did fold my fabric in half so that when I cut it out, it will be 2 different sheets of fabric. So then once I'm done tracing it, I'm just going in with my scissors and cutting it out. And like I said, I did fold the fabric over so that when I cut it out, I have 2 pumpkin shapes. Then I'm hot gluing the 2 fabric pumpkin sheets together. I placed the hot glue around the very outer edge of the pumpkin and then just press the 2 pieces of fabric together. If you don't want to use hot glue, you can always use fabric glue, fabric tape, or you can sew them if you're good at sewing. I, on the other hand, am not, so hot glue is my best friend today. I did leave an opening at the very top to fill my pumpkin, and I am filling it with polyfill. You can get polyfill at pretty much any craft store, and places like Walmart sell it as well. I filled my pumpkin to the stuffiness that I wanted it to be, which I do like a pretty full pumpkin. And then once I got to the very top, I glued a little bit more together, but I did leave still a very small opening, and that is where I'm going to be placing my stem. To create my stem, I am using 3 of these branches. These came from Hobby Lobby, and I'm using hot glue to attach 2 of the branches side by side, and then the 3rd branch I'm going to be hot gluing right in between the other 2 branches over top. I'm then placing the branches in that top hole of my pumpkin, and once I get it all placed where I want it to be, I'm then hot gluing the fabric around the branches. To add some detail to my pumpkin, I'm using 2 pieces of this rope trim. This is from Hobby Lobby, and I'm hot gluing the ends of that at the very top of my pumpkin and next to the branches, and then I'm having that go down and around the pumpkin where it curves up on the very bottom of the pumpkin, and then when it comes back around on the other side, I'm just cutting the rope off, and again, just hot gluing that at the very top. And I did the exact same thing with 2 more pieces of rope trim on the other side of the pumpkin. Then I'm adding some floral. This is a wheat floral that I've had in my stash for a while, and I thought it would be really cute to add this yellow color to the top of the pumpkin. So I just cut the wheat down a little bit, and then I added small pieces of it around the top stem of the pumpkin. I then added some more florals. I'm not even sure really what these are. These are off of a fall stem from Hobby Lobby, but I just really like the color and I like the texture of these, so I added that to the top of the pumpkin around where I had just added the yellow wheat. For the last little detail to this pumpkin, I created a raffia bow, and then I just glued that at the top stem of the pumpkin. What I didn't get filmed is I did end up adding another raffia bow that's already pre-made with a little button on it from Hobby Lobby right over top of the raffia bow that I just created. This is what the pumpkin looks like all finished. I did end up making a larger one as well. These were so easy to create, and what's great about these is they are perfect for using scrap fabric that you already have at home. Now moving on to DIY number 2. For this project, I'm going to be using this cute little wagon from the Target dollar spot. It was $5, and I just think it is the cutest thing, and I wanted to add a few little extra details to this piece. I'm also going to be using this little bit larger of a dowel rod. I did cut it down into 2 different pieces. The longer piece is 4.5 inches, and then the smaller piece is 1/2 of an inch. I'm also using a tumbling tower block from Dollar Tree, and as you can see here, I've already taken my drill and drilled a little divot in the end of it so that my dowel rod will fit inside of that little hole. Then I'm taking my folk art chalk paint in the color Rich Black, and I'm painting my little Jenga or tumbling tower block from Dollar Tree, and then also the 2 pieces of dowel rod. I'm then attaching my block using some hot glue to the bottom of my wagon, but I'm leaving where I've drilled the little divot sticking out from the front of the wagon. Once I have that glued, I'm then going to be attaching my dowel in that little divot hole that I've already drilled. I place the hot glue in the hole, and then I press down my dowel inside of the hole to attach it. Then for the very last little piece of dowel, I'm just attaching that at the top of the larger one, and I used hot glue to attach it, and I just placed it at the top, and this is going to be the little handle to my wagon. Then it was time to create a sign to go on the side of my wagon. I am using this small little scrap piece of wood. This did come from Dollar Tree in an assortment wood pack that I got a while ago, and I'm just painting it with that Rich Black chalk paint. I let the paint dry, and I did create a little sign on my Cricut to go on this piece of wood. It just says Farm Fresh Pumpkins. If you don't have a Cricut to create this, you can always use stickers or just hand write this on your piece of wood with a marker. I then hot glued my little sign on the center post of my wagon. Then I'm going to be adding some of this hay from Dollar Tree. This is one of the little mini hay bales that you can get there. I did take my pliers and cut off the little wire that was around it because I did want to have the hay just like spread on the inside of my wagon. And this stuff is super messy, but I think it was worth it because this turned out really cute. So once I have all of my little hay inside of the wagon, I just place some mini pumpkins inside of the hay or over top of the hay. And I did end up adding a few little pine cones as well. And this is what my wagon looks like all finished. I only did a few little changes, but the ones that I did make, I think made a huge difference. I just love how this turned out. And as you can tell, I did switch out the pumpkins for ones that were a little bit more colorful. Back into today's projects for DIY number 3. For this one, I'm going to be using this wood block. This one did come from Michaels. It is from the Art Minds brand. And then I'm just painting it with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I'm also going to be using this larger piece of wood. This did come from Hobby Lobby and I've already cut mine down to 12.5 inches. I'm also painting this piece with that same plaster color chalk paint. I'm also using these 3 arrows. These did come off of a sign from the Target dollar spot and I've just had them sitting in my craft stash for a while, so I figured I would use them for today's project. The first one I'm going to be painting with the Folk Art acrylic matte paint in the color Pueblo. And then for the second one, I'm going to be painting it in the color Vintage Mustard from Folk Art. And then the third arrow I'm painting with the color True Burgundy, also from Folk Art. I am using another scrap piece of wood. This one is 7 inches long. I forgot to mention that the arrows were 8.5 inches long. For this piece, I am painting it with that same plaster colored chalk paint, and then I let all the paint dry. And for this project, I did use my Cricut and I created this first one that says Harvest Farms, just really simple, and I transferred that onto my block that I just painted. If you don't have a Cricut, you can always use stickers or just hand write these words on with a marker. For the orange color arrow, I did the words that say pumpkin patch. For the vintage mustard, I did hay rides. And then for the burgundy colored arrow, I did the words apple picking. I then took the arrows and placed them onto the larger block that I had already painted and just kind of spaced them out where I wanted them to be, with the Harvest Farms at the very top. And then I just used hot glue to attach each arrow and then the sign at the very top. Then it was time to start adding some detail, so I took 2 strands of jute and wrapped them around the very top of my sign above the word harvest, and then the ends of the jute I just stapled to the very back of the sign. And then I did the same thing again with 2 strands of jute, only this time under the word farms, and just wrap that around and use my staple gun to secure the jute in place. I then created a really simple bow with this mustard colored raffia that I recently picked up from Hobby Lobby. And once I had my bow made, I cut the tail ends of the raffia to my desired liking. And then I hot glued that bow in the top left-hand corner of the top of the sign. I then added a little button to the very center of my bow. Next, it was time to get my pole assembled, so I placed hot glue in the very bottom of my block, stand piece, I guess you could call it, and then just placed the pole on top of that. I am going to be using these 3 little mini wood pumpkins. These are from Hobby Lobby, and I'm painting all 3 of the pumpkins with the Folk Art matte acrylic paint in the color Pueblo, and I just did 1 coat of paint. And then for the stems of the pumpkins, I did them in the Folk Art paint in the color Raw Sienna. I was finally able to find these little mini hay bales from Dollar Tree, and I thought this project would be perfect to finally use them. So I just have them placed at the very bottom of my sign, and I'm hot gluing each one of them down into place. And then over top of the hay bales, I'm hot gluing all 3 of my pumpkins. And I did add a little pine cone just for some extra detail. And this is what the piece looks like all finished. This one was so easy to do, and it definitely is a statement piece. I am going to be using this for years to come. Moving right along into DIY number 4. For this one, I'm going to be using this unfinished wood palette pumpkin from Dollar Tree. I've already removed the hanger that was on the top of the sign, and now I'm just painting on my folk art wood tint in the color Walnut. I paint on a good amount, and I am working in sections, and then I'm just wiping away the excess wood tint with an old rag. I'm also using this mini wooden crate from Dollar Tree, and I'm doing the same thing as I did with the pumpkin. I'm using my folk art wood tint in the color Walnut, just painting it on and then wiping away the excess tint with a rag, and I did this to the entire crate. I placed the pumpkin onto the crate and got it spaced exactly right on the back to where they line up, and then I just used some hot glue to attach them together. Then I'm using some Spanish moss, also from Dollar Tree. I'm just placing it inside of my crate. And then I'm going to be using some of these really pretty dark and light yellow flowers. These ones I believe are from Hobby Lobby, but they might be from Michael's. So I just took some of them off of their stems so that it was easier for when I'm going to put them in my crate. And then I'm also using some of these mini little sunflowers. These ones are from Hobby Lobby. And I did use my pliers to cut them down again so that they're easier to place inside of my crate. I then just started placing them in the Spanish moss, and I ended up adding some cornstalk pieces around the flowers, and then I also added a few little pine cones as well. Next, I'm taking this piece of fabric. This fabric is from Hobby Lobby, and I just cut a long strip of it, and then I'm wrapping it around the stem on top of my pumpkin and then just tying it in a knot. I'm also going to be using some raffia. I took a few different strands, wrapped it around the stem of the top of the pumpkin, and then just tied that into a double knot. Then to make sure that my fabric stays in place and to cover up the holes that were already in the top of the pumpkin, I just hot glued the fabric over top of those holes. And then for this project, I'm also going to be using this Grateful word cutout. This one did come from Hobby Lobby, and I painted it with my plaster color chalk paint. I did lose the clip where I was doing that, so I'm just letting you guys know where I got this word cutout and what I painted it with. So I'm just using some hot glue on the back side of the cutout, and then I'm placing it in the top left-hand side of my pumpkin. And I did end up adding a little raffia bow with a button that is also from Hobby Lobby. This is what it looks like all finished. I think this one is so rustic and cute, and it was really easy to do. Now for the fifth and final project. Today I'm going to be using this glass jar from Hobby Lobby. It was $3.99, but then I got it half off of that, and it did come with a cork in it, but I just removed that and I'll be saving it for later. I took a piece of jute and I tied it around the very bottom of my jar, and then I'm going to just start wrapping the jute around the jar over and over, making sure that I hold the jute really tight when doing this, and then just keeping the jute at the bottom half of the jar. Once I get it wrapped around a few times, I did take a little bit of hot glue and then just secure the jute into place. And then I would continue just going around and around and around again until I got to the very bottom. And then again, just used hot glue to secure that jute into place. I'm also using these wood letter beads to spell out the word fall. I'm taking each bead and stringing them onto a piece of raffia, and then once I have them all strung next to the last letter L, I am tying a double knot to make sure that the letters stay on the raffia and don't move around. I'm then setting that aside and then taking several more strands of raffia and tying them around the top of my jar, and I tied a double knot and then just cut off the excess ends that were super long. Next, I'm taking the wood beads and the extra little raffia piece next to the letter F. I strung it around the raffia that I just tied around my jar, and then now I'm taking that strand that was still attached I hope this makes sense. And I'm putting it back through each one of the beads and then just tying that off in a knot to hold all of the beads in place and to now have it attached to the raffia that's on the jar. And then for the last step, I ended up just adding some fall colored floral from Hobby Lobby. This is what the jar looks like all finished. I think it looks super high end and it was really easy to do for only a few dollars. By far the easiest project in today's video. For the first project today, I'm going to be using this unfinished wood leaf from Dollar Tree. This is new to Dollar Tree this year for fall, and I'm first just removing the jute hanger that's on the leaf, and then I'm going to be using this leaf paper. I believe this is from Hobby Lobby and it was a little under 60 cents, and I'm going to be cutting it out so that I can place it on two of the inner slats on my leaf. And I'm just taking the paper and I'm placing it over the slat that I'm going to be attaching it to and using my pencil to trace that out. And then I thought it was a good idea to just use my utility knife to cut where one of the slats was, so it'll be a little bit easier for me to cut it out. And then I just cut the remaining parts with my scissors. I then did the same exact thing that I did on the other side for the opposite side when tracing and cutting out my leaf paper. After I have all of my paper cut out, and then I can start painting. For the slats that I'm not going to be using the paper on, I'm using my plaster color paint from Waverly, and I did the two outer slats of my leaf and then also the inner middle slat of my leaf with this color. Once all of that paint was dry, I then started attaching my pieces of paper that I cut out, and I just placed Mod Podge on the back of the paper and painted that on with a brush, and then placed that onto the wood slat that I'm attaching it to, and then just made sure that I pressed out any bubbles and it's nice and smooth. I then did the same thing to the other side, only this time I painted the Mod Podge right onto the wood to make it a little bit easier, then placed the paper on top of that and pressed out any of the bubbles. Then to make sure that my paper is protected, I painted the Mod Podge over top of my paper on both sides. And then I let that sit to dry for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then for the word that I'm going to be using on this sign, it's this Hello Fall word that came in a pack of fall words at Dollar Tree. I'd originally painted it with like a mustard color and I didn't like that, so I ended up painting over it with my Java color chalk paint from Folk Art, and I only had to do one coat of that paint. Then once it was all dry, I used some of my plaster paint and just very lightly dry brushed that over top just to give it a little bit more dimension and more of a rustic look. Then for the stem of my leaf, I'm painting that with the hazelnut chalk paint from Waverly. Once my Mod Podge has completely dried, I'm then going to be cutting off any of that paper that's overlapping my wood slats. To do that, I'm just using some sandpaper and sanding around all of the edges. This is a really easy way to cut the paper around the wood, and it's going to give me such a nice clean look. And I did this around both slats that had my leaf paper. Next, I wanted to add a little bit of distressing around my entire leaf just to give it more of a rustic feel. So I took that Java colored paint on a chip brush and just very lightly dry brushed that over top of my entire leaf. And then I decided to add some raffia around the stem of my leaf. So I took probably about like 6 pieces of it, tied it around the stem, and then made a really simple bow. Any of the long pieces of raffia, I just cut those off. And then to secure my bow, I used a little bit of hot glue underneath just to make sure that it stays in place. And then it was time for me to attach my word. So I just placed hot glue on the back of that and hot glued it right to the center of my leaf. And then adding some of this berry garland that was also from Dollar Tree, I cut it and then just wrapped it around my finger to give it a curly look, and then I wrapped those around the stem of my leaf, one on each side. For the last step in this project, I made a jute hanger and then hot glued the jute on the back side of my leaf. This is what my leaf looks like all finished. I ended up just placing mine in the center of one of my wreaths, and I think it turned out so beautiful. Moving right along into DIY number 2 for today, I'm using these 3 wooden pumpkins from Dollar Tree, 2 taller ones and 1 shorter one. I've already removed the burlap bow that was on those, and you can see a little bit of glue left on the pumpkins, but I'm not worried about that because I'll be covering it up later. I am painting both of these pumpkins with the folk art chalk paint in the color Vintage Mustard, and I just love this color for fall. Then for the shorter pumpkin, I'm painting that with the Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I did have to do about 3 coats over that R to give it covered up. To add some detail to my pumpkins, I'm using some of these sticker beads and I'm placing them on the center of my pumpkins, and I did have to attach them together to get them to go all the way around, so I just pieced each bead sticker together so that they matched up perfectly, and I did do that on all of my pumpkins. You can see here that I ran out of the red beads, but the blue beads are exactly the same size and shape, and I am going to be just painting over them. As you can see here, for my mustard color pumpkins, I'm obviously painting the beads with the mustard color, and it would have been a lot easier if I would have just placed the beads on before I even painted my pumpkins, but I didn't think of this idea until after I had already painted them. Then for my shorter pumpkin, I'm doing the same thing. I'm placing the beads all the way around the center portion of my pumpkin. And then obviously for this one, I'm going to be painting over those beads with my plastered colored paint so that it matches the rest of my pumpkin. Since I want these pumpkins to look a little bit more rustic, I'm adding some detail and dry brushing. For the color I'm doing first, I'm using the hazelnut color from Waverly, and I went around all of the edges of the pumpkins and then like all of the grooves as well. And then for the next color, I'm using Plaster from Waverly, and I just went right over all of the areas that I did the hazelnut color, and then after the Plaster color, I added a little bit of the Java color from Folk Art. And this really just added a lot of dimension to my pumpkin and gave me that rustic feel. For the Plaster color pumpkin, I did the same thing, only I left out the Plaster color, so I just did the hazelnut, and then over the hazelnut, I did the Java colored paint. And then for the stems on all of my pumpkins, I painted those with the hazelnut colored paint. I'm using this wood word cutout that says "Give Thanks" from the fall word pack at Dollar Tree this year, and I'm just staining it with my Craft Smart wood stain in the color brown. And once that was all stained, it was ready for me to attach to the center of my plastered color pumpkin. I just placed hot glue right on the back side and glued it to the front of the pumpkin. Then to add some detail to my pumpkins, I'm using some Spanish moss at the very top of the pumpkin right underneath the stem, and then I'm using some of these little leaves that came on the berry garland that I had gotten from Hobby Lobby, but you can get little leaves like this at Dollar Tree on any of their stems really. So I hot glued a leaf going in the right direction and then hot glued a leaf going in the left direction on the mustard color ones. Then for the top of my plastered color pumpkin, I added the Spanish moss, and then I added some of the berry garland at the very top on one side, and then on the other side I added a leaf. And this is what my pumpkins look like all finished. I think they turned out super cute. They were really easy to transform, and they go perfect with the color theme that I have for fall this year in my home. Now moving right along into DIY number 3. For this one, I'm going to be using this unfinished wood fence from Dollar Tree. I first removed the jute hanger on the back, and then I started painting the entire fence with my plastered color chalk paint. And then I'm going to be using these wood pumpkins. These ones are from the Target Dollar Spot last year, but Dollar Tree has unfinished wood pumpkins as well. And I'm painting the largest one with that vintage mustard colored paint. And then for the 2 smaller pumpkins, I'm painting those with the pumpkin colored paint from Waverly. These 2 smaller pumpkins do have little leaves on them, and then for the leaves, I painted those with the color Sage Shadow from Folk Art. And then for all of the stems on my pumpkins, I'm using Hazelnut from Waverly. I'm adding some detail to the front of all of my pumpkins and just painting on some of the grooves that would be on a real pumpkin. I did hazelnut for the first color, and then I wanted to add a second color. So right over top of the hazelnut, I'm adding my plastered colored paint. just to give my pumpkins more of like a realistic look than just having that flat surface with no detail. And I did that on all 3 pumpkins. Then for this one, I'm also using one of these word cutouts from Dollar Tree, the fall word pack, and this one says Hello Autumn, and I'm painting that with the hazelnut colored paint. Once all the paint was dry, I then just started piecing everything together. Once I had it all set to where I wanted it to be, I started gluing everything down. I used hot glue to attach everything and just placed the hot glue on the back and then glued it to the front of my fence. Next, I'm adding some Spanish moss underneath all of my pumpkins. I'm using hot glue right onto the surface of my fence and then pressing the moss over that. It was really messy looking, so once everything was glued, I then just trimmed it down a little bit with my scissors. And then I'm using this really pretty orange and cream color like checked ribbon. This ribbon is from Hobby Lobby. I made a simple bow, and then before I attached the bow, I attached one of these pine cones that I had in my craft stash and then glued the bow underneath the pine cone. For the last step, I'm creating a hanger. I took 2 pieces of jute and then just sized them down to the size that I wanted my hanger to be. I did a knot on each end, and then I hot glued those on the back side of my fence. And here is the Hello Autumn mini fence sign all finished. I ended up placing it in the center of one of my mini wreaths, but it would also look super cute on a tiered tray. Now for the 4th DIY today, I found these super cute candle holders at Dollar Tree, and they're really pretty the way that they are, but I wanted them to fit with my decor a little bit better. So I hand painted them with the plaster color chalk paint from Waverly. These would be really easy if you wanted to spray paint them, but I just hand painted them, and I did do 2 different coats of paint for this. Once that paint was all dry, I then wanted them to have a little bit of distressing and rustic look to them. As you guys know, that's the look that I currently have in my home. So I dry brushed them with the Castle Color chalk paint from Folk Art. And then for the pumpkins, I'm going to be using these 2 from Dollar Tree. And I first removed the stems of the pumpkins and then also the fabric of the pumpkins because I'm just going to be using the foam part of the pumpkins. Then I'm just painting both of the stems with the hazelnut color from Waverly, and I only did 1 coat because I still wanted some of that darker brown color to pop through the hazelnut color. For this project, I'm using this really pretty yellow fabric. This fabric is from Hobby Lobby, and I just started cutting them to about 2 inches in thickness, and I did several different strips for this, and it was really easy to measure it because there was already the lines on the fabric. Once I had all of the fabric cut out, then I could start attaching it to my pumpkin. I'm using Mod Podge right on the pumpkin and then just painted that on with one of my brushes. I painted a really thin coat of it. I probably used a little bit too much glue than what I needed, but now I know my fabric will stay on really well. So then I started placing the fabric in the very top hole of the pumpkin and then just making sure it was really tight over top of my Mod Podge. I did have to trim the ends of it up a little bit on the bottom of my pumpkin, but I just made sure that all of the fabric was really, really smooth. And then for the next piece of fabric, I did the same thing. I just put the Mod Podge on the pumpkin, painted it on with my paintbrush, and then I did overlap my second piece of fabric over top of the first piece of fabric so that my entire pumpkin is covered in fabric and you don't see any of that styrofoam. So basically it's just the same steps over and over again until you get your pumpkin entirely covered with the fabric. Just placing the Mod Podge on the pumpkin, painting it on with your brush, then the fabric. Now that I have my pumpkin all covered in fabric, I started adding some raffia. I took about 4 pieces, tied it in a knot, and then I'm sticking it down into the hole that's at the top of the pumpkin. I did use a paintbrush to push it in there really well, and then I just took that raffia and wrapped it around my pumpkin through one of the grooves, and then tied another knot just to make sure that the raffia holds together, and then stuck that knot into the top hole of the pumpkin, again using my paintbrush to give me a little bit of help sticking it way down in there. I continued that same step of making a knot with about 4 pieces of raffia, sticking it down into the top of the pumpkin and then wrapping it around one of the grooves of the pumpkin, and then again taking the other end and sticking it back down into the top of the pumpkin. I did that for all of the grooves around the pumpkin so that it would add some nice detail. Once that was all covered with the raffia, then I just stuck my stem back into the top of the pumpkin. Next, I'm taking about 5 or 6 strands of jute and I'm tying them into a really simple bow. And then I'm cutting the extra long ends off and then hot gluing that jute bow at the top of my pumpkin underneath my stem. Then I'm adding some of this berry garland. That was the Dollar Tree one that I just showed you, but I wanted to add ones that were a little bit more muted in color. So I cut these off of the stems that I had picked up from Hobby Lobby. I just curled them around my finger and then I ended up adding one of the little leaves that was on that stem garland as well. I added the leaf on one side and then I added the berry garland on the other side of my pumpkin. I did do a second pumpkin. For this one, I'm very quickly gonna go over it. I am going to be using some burlap on this one and I did not want the white styrofoam to show through, so I did paint my entire pumpkin with the hazelnut color from Waverly. Then for the burlap fabric that I'm using, this is actually a bandana from Hobby Lobby and it's a burlap and it's just a little bit cheaper if you're only going to be doing a small project. And I did cut those into about 2 to 3 inches in thickness, and then I also did that same yellow color fabric that I used on the last pumpkin. Then for this one, same steps. I used the Mod Podge. I painted it onto my pumpkin and then I added the fabric. I first started with the yellow colored fabric on my pumpkin. Once I had the yellow color added, then I went ahead and added the burlap color or the burlap fabric right next to the yellow fabric. Same steps, put the Mod Podge on the pumpkin, then place your fabric overlapping the first fabric. Once the fabric was all on my pumpkin, then I'm going to be adding some raffia. For this one, I took about 5 pieces of raffia, tied it in a knot in the center of the raffia, and then I pressed that knot right down into the hole of my pumpkin so that I had raffia sticking out of the top of the pumpkin. I then placed my stem back into the hole of the pumpkin right in the center of all of the raffia that I added. And then for this one, I'm going to be adding a little bit of that jute garland from Hobby Lobby. And for this one, I left some of the leaves and the little acorns that was on them so that I could have some detail. Then for this one, I did make a really simple small raffia bow, and then I hot glued that right underneath the stem of my pumpkin. And here are both of my pumpkins and my candlesticks all finished. I ended up placing the pumpkins on some Spanish moss right on top of the candlesticks, and I just love the way that these ones turned out. Now for the 5th and final DIY today. For this one, I'm using this vertical unfinished sign with a pumpkin cutout. This is from Dollar Tree, and I first removed the jute hanger and then I started painting it with my vintage mustard colored chalk paint from Folk Art, and I did have to do 3 different coats of this paint to get the black color covered up. Then once that color was all dry, I wanted to give this sign more of a rustic look. So I took some of my Java colored chalk paint from Folk Art and I started dry brushing that around all of the edges of the sign. And then I did take that color a little bit going in vertical motions on the front of my sign as well. I'm using this unfinished wood pumpkin that came from the wood garland pack from Dollar Tree, and then also this Farm Fresh word cutout. This one did break, but I am just going to be gluing it together. And then also unfinished wood letters from Dollar Tree that spell out the word pumpkin. For my unfinished wood pumpkin, then for my Farm Fresh word cutouts, and then also all of my letters that spell out the word pumpkins, I'm painting those all with the Waverly paint in plaster. I'm also using these 2 wood leaves. These ones did come from Hobby Lobby, but Dollar Tree has ones that are very similar. I stained them with my Craftsmart wood stain in the color brown, but I really didn't like the look of that, so I ended up going over them with a yellow colored paint. and then it was time to start assembling everything together. I flipped over my vertical sign and put hot glue around the pumpkin cutout and then just glued my unfinished wood cutout to the back of that. Then I started placing all of my words and my letters on my sign just to kind of figure out where I want them to go before I start attaching them. And then once I had them all figured out, I started hot gluing each letter of the word pumpkins down with some hot glue. I wanted to add some burlap underneath my words farm fresh, so I'm just taking some of this burlap ribbon, cutting it down so that it will go along the very front of my sign above my words pumpkin, and then I hot glued the ends of the ribbon along the back side of my sign. I then used hot glue to attach the farm fresh word cutout right in the center of my burlap ribbon. I'm then using this pumpkin ribbon from Dollar Tree, and I made a really simple bow with the ribbon, and then I am going to be attaching it to the very top left corner of my sign. Then to add some detail to the bottom of my sign under the word pumpkins, I'm using some of this white cotton cord, and I just cut it down to size, and then I'm hot gluing the two ends along the back side of my sign so that it is wrapped around the front of my sign. Then I'm adding the two leaves that I painted. I actually glued the leaves together already, and then I just hot glued them right next to the words farm fresh. For the very last step, I'm adding a hanger to my sign. I'm using, again, this white cotton cord. I made a knot on two of the ends, and then instead of putting the hanger along the back side, I thought it would be really cute to add that knotted detail on the front, so I just hot glued those right over top of the holes that were pre-drilled in the sign. And this is my Farm Fresh pumpkin sign all finished. I ended up placing it on a hanger on my front porch, and I think it turned out super cute, and it was so easy to do. For the first project today, I'm using this tiered unfinished wood pumpkin that I picked up from Joann Fabrics last year. It was $4 or $5.99, and I got it for half off of that. I started by painting the top pumpkin with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory, and I did one coat of that paint. Then I moved on to the middle pumpkin, and I painted that with the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Hazy. This paint color is a little bit more sheer, so I did do 3 coats of that paint to get it all covered the way I wanted it to be. Then for my bottom pumpkin, I painted that with the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Vintage Mustard. And I just love the color of this. It's not too bright, and it is more of like a muted pumpkin color. And then for the very top stem, I'm painting that with the Folk Art paint in the color Hazelnut. For what's going to be the base of my pumpkins, I'm using this scrap piece of wood that's either from Home Depot or Lowe's, and it is 4 inches by 10 inches. And I stained it with my Craft Smart wood stain in the color brown, and I just used an old towel to apply the stain. To give my pumpkins a little bit more detail and to make them look a little bit more rustic, I used my Waverly paint in the color Hazelnut on a fluffy paintbrush, and I very lightly painted that color around all of the openings in the pumpkin, and I just really like the detail that it added. For this project, I'm using these fall word cutouts. These are from Hobby Lobby, and they all did come in a pack together, and they are in the fall section at Hobby Lobby. And I'm just painting all 3 of the words with my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Castle. Once that paint dried, I wanted them to have a little bit more detail to them, so I'm just dry brushing my Waverly paint in the color Ivory over top of all 3 of the words. Now it's time to attach all of my words. I'm using hot glue right on the back side of each word. And the top pumpkin, I'm putting the word grateful. The middle pumpkin, I'm gluing the word thankful on. And then for my very bottom pumpkin, I'm gluing the word blessed. I'm going to be making all of these pumpkins stand. So I'm using this block, and I'm attaching it to the back bottom side of my pumpkin using some hot glue, and this is just going to add some stability to my pumpkins. Then I'm placing hot glue on the bottom of all of the pumpkins and that piece of wood, and I'm attaching it in the center of my 4x10 piece of wood. It would probably be best to use a stronger glue like E6000, but I just used the hot glue for the sake of the video. Next, I'm adding some of these fall stems. These ones are from Hobby Lobby. I really love the color of these. I have several of them and I will be using them in a lot of my projects today. I just cut the stems off and then I'm wrapping them around the very top of my pumpkin stem and then curling the ends of the wires a little bit. I had added this pine cone and some of these really tiny mini pumpkins from the pumpkin and pine cone like bundles that you can get from Dollar Tree, but I ended up not liking the pine cone, so I just pulled that off. I did leave all of the little mini pumpkins on, and then I added some more of these fall florals. These ones are from Hobby Lobby. I just cut a small piece off, glued it on underneath the pumpkins, and then added a fall leaf at the top. And here are my standing tiered pumpkins all finished. This one turned out so good. I love everything about it, and it was super easy to create. Now moving into DIY number 2. For this one, I'm going to be using one of these unfinished wood pumpkins from Dollar Tree. These are so cute. And I just started by taking off the raffia bow. I'm not sure why they had a raffia bow on something that's unfinished and you're meant to like paint and stuff. I think that's kind of weird, but I just took mine off since I will not be using it. And then I started to paint all of the underneath parts of my pumpkin with that folk art chalk paint in the color Vintage Mustard. Again, I just love this color. It is the perfect like rustic-y pumpkin color. Once that was painted, and then for all of the top pieces of the pumpkin, I painted those with the Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. Although you can probably skip this step. I'm going to be adding fabric over top of these, but I didn't know if you would be able to see through the fabric. You ended up not being able to, so I could have just skipped that step. The fabric I'm using is a burlap fabric. This is actually a bandana from Hobby Lobby. It was only like $1.49 and it's just the perfect amount to use for projects. I ended up cutting a piece of it down a little bit so that it would be easier to work with. And then I took a pencil and just traced over those top pieces on my pumpkin so I would know exactly where to cut out. After I had all of my shapes traced out, I then cut out all 3 of my shapes, and then it was time to add them to the top part of my pumpkin. I placed hot glue right on the wood piece and then placed the burlap fabric over top. And then I wanted to add some of this white cotton cord. This is from Hobby Lobby, and I just added it around all of the edges of each one of the shapes, and I used hot glue to attach the cotton cord. And I did that for all 3 of the top shapes on my pumpkin. For this project, I'm using this Thankful word cutout. This is just like the one I used in the last DIY, and it did come from the same pack of words. And I'm painting this one with a Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. And then once the paint was all dry, I then used some hot glue to attach it to the very front center of my pumpkin. Then to add some detail to the top of my pumpkin, I'm using some of these fall stems from Hobby Lobby. These are just like the ones I used in the last DIY. I'm taking the wires on these and I'm just wrapping them around the very top of my pumpkin stem. And then I decided to add a raffia bow, and the raffia I'm using is from Dollar Tree. I just used several strands of it. I tied it around the top stem of the pumpkin and made a really simple bow. I then cut the really long ends off, and then I used a little bit of hot glue to hold the bow into place. And then for the very last step in this DIY, I took some jute and I'm just stringing it through the hole that was already pre-drilled into the pumpkin to create my hanger. And here is my Thankful pumpkin all finished. I love the traditional fall colors on this one, and again, it was just a super easy project to do. Now moving right along into DIY number 3. For this one, I'm using an 8x10 canvas from Dollar Tree, and I'm first taking a utility knife and I'm cutting around all of the outside edges of the staples along the back side of the canvas because I'm going to be removing it from its frame. You do want to make sure that you're using a sharp utility knife and being very careful when doing this so that you don't cut yourself. After I have the canvas removed, I'm then cutting the canvas down so that it's the correct size to fit on the back side of the frame without any of the canvas edges hanging over. Before I start attaching the canvas back on the frame, I wanted to stain it, and the stain that I'm using, it's actually a wood tint. It's by Folk Art and it's in the color Walnut. It's actually a little bit darker than I thought it was going to be, but it's still a really beautiful color. Once the stain dried, then I started to hot glue my canvas on the back side of the frame, and I did flip the canvas so it has like the more ivory color facing the front of the frame, and I just went around all four edges with the hot glue and pressed the canvas on, and I made sure that it was really taut so I didn't have any wrinkles on the front side. Then I'm going to be using this pumpkin stencil. This is from Hobby Lobby, and it came in a 2-pack, but I'm just using the pumpkin for this one. And the stencil was a little bit too large, so I'm just cutting off all of the little leaves and acorns since I'm not going to be using those, so that I can make my stencil a little bit smaller and it'll then fit in the center of my frame. To keep my pumpkin in place, I'm using some painter's tape around all of the edges, and I also am using this so that I don't accidentally get paint onto my canvas. I always like to do this because I'm pretty clumsy, and I also am covering up the stem of the pumpkin since I'll be painting that in a different color. For the actual pumpkin color, I'm using the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Hazy, and I just built this color up on the canvas, but I did let some of that like ivory canvas color poke through a little bit. I didn't want it to be like completely covered. I wanted it to have more of like a farmhousey rustic feel. And then once that was dry, I took off the painter's tape from the stem, and then I placed it around the stem, like on the pumpkin that I just painted, so that I wouldn't accidentally get paint on that. And then for the stem color, I'm stenciling on, it is the hazelnut from Waverly. Once everything was all dry, I then removed all of the painter's tape and the stencil from my canvas. For the top of my pumpkin, I thought it would be really pretty to add a pop of color, and I'm using this orange and ivory buffalo check ribbon from Hobby Lobby. I created a really simple bow, and then I'm also using those same fall stems from Hobby Lobby. I cut them off, and then I just wrapped the wires around my finger so that they would curl up a little bit. I then used hot glue to attach each one of my little wire stems that I have here, and then also the bow right in the center of those stems. And here is my painted pumpkin all finished. I love the neutral color on this with that pop of orange. It's very classic and it goes great with my farmhouse decor. Not to mention it was super easy. Now for DIY number 4 for this project. This one is so easy. I'm using one of these little palettes that I picked up from a Dollar Tree, and then I'm staining it with my Craftsmart wood stain in the color brown. Again, just using an old towel to apply the stain, and in all the little areas that I couldn't get with my towel, I'm using a paintbrush just to get that stain in those hard to reach areas. I'm using 3 of these wooden pumpkin stickers that came in a pack from Hobby Lobby. I'm also using this Hello Fall saying that came from the Target Dollar Spot last year, and then also a unfinished wood cap, and these come in a pack and you can get them at Michael's, Hobby Lobby, or pretty much any craft store. I started by painting the cap with the Waverly paint in the color Ivory. Once that paint was dry, I then took the hazelnut color from Waverly and very lightly painted that around the grooves of the cap and also the top. Then I started placing everything together. I placed hot glue on the back side of the Hello Fall saying and placed that on the very top of my palette. And then I started to attach all 3 of my pumpkins. I did have them sitting on top of one another, and I just used hot glue to attach them right in the center of my palette. Then for the very last step, I attached my cap to the very top center of my palette. This project is by far the easiest in today's video, and I think it just turned out super cute, and it's perfect to place on a tiered tray. Now going right along into the 5th and final DIY today, I'm creating mini pumpkins, and I'm going to be using these tumbling tower blocks from Dollar Tree. And to create just one pumpkin, I'm going to be using 8 of the tumbling tower blocks. I wanted my pumpkin to be white, so I'm painting all 8 of my blocks with the Waverly paint in the color Ivory. Once the paint was all dry, I then started attaching them with hot glue. I placed hot glue on one side of my tumbling tower blocks, and then I took another block and I turned it the opposite direction and attached it together. It's easier for you to watch than for me to explain this, but I just attached them by hot gluing them together like you can see me doing here. I did 3 and 3 for each side of my pumpkin like you can see here. It's going to be the front and back of the pumpkin, and then I also used 2 of the blocks for the sides of my pumpkin. So for the ones that I'm using for the side, I'm placing hot glue right along the edge of the blocks and then pressing them together with the front and back sides of my pumpkin. I hope that made sense. It's kind of hard to explain that. But once I had it all glued together, I then used my hazelnut colored chalk paint from Waverly, and I very lightly dry brushed this around my entire wood block pumpkin to give it more of a rustic look. For the stem of my pumpkin, I'm using a stick that I found in my yard. I just cut it down to the correct size, and then I'm hot gluing it in the center of all of the blocks. And then I'm using some hot glue to attach some Spanish moss all around that stick. And then I'm also using, of course, once again, these cute little wire stems from the fall little picks that I had from Hobby Lobby, and I just wrapped them around the stem. I ended up doing another pumpkin in a different color, and I thought it was really cute to pair them together on one of my tiered trays. For the first DIY today, I'm going to be creating a wreath, and I'm going to be using this embroidery hoop. This is just the outer ring of the hoop because I already used the inside for another project. I'm also using some fabric. This fabric here is from Hobby Lobby, and it just screams fall to me. I love all of these colors together. So I'm going to be cutting all of my fabric in strips. So I just placed 2 pieces of the fabric together so that I could cut out more strips at one time. And then I'm cutting my strips in about 1 inch or so in width. And I just continued to do this until I had a ton of different strips cut out. And I'm also using this pumpkin fabric. This is from Walmart, and I think I got it last year or the year before, and I've just not used it yet. And it did come in a fat quarter, and I'm doing the same thing here. I'm just cutting this fabric into strips that are about 1 inch or so in width. Then I'm also using this yellow fabric. This one is also from Hobby Lobby. I have tons of scrap fabric because I use so much for all of my projects. So for a rag wreath, it's a great way to use up all of your fabric. This is from Walmart, this leaf fabric here, and it did come in a fat quarter, and I believe I got it last year. Same thing here, just cutting out my fabric into a bunch of different strips. Then once I have all of my strips cut out, I'm going to be tying them around my embroidery hoop in a knot. And then once I have that tied around, I just move the knot up to the top of the hoop. And then I just continued to do that over and over, and I just switched between each fabric. I did this bright yellow fabric, and then I would do the pumpkin fabric after that one. Then after the pumpkin fabric, I would do the lighter checked fabric. And then after that one, I would do my leaf fabric. And I just kept switching that up until I had all of my fabric tied around my entire embroidery hoop. Once my fabric was all tied on, some of the pieces were a little bit longer than the other ones, so I just trimmed the longer ones up. And then it was time to make my little sign that I'm going to have on the front of my wreath. I'm using one of these wood planks from Dollar Tree, and then I'm painting that plank with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. And then to distress it a little bit, I used some of my Java colored paint from Folk Art, and I just really lightly dry brushed that around all of the edges and then a little bit on the front of this piece of wood as well. And then I'm using this Welcome Fall. This came in a pack of wood cutouts from Dollar Tree this year, and I'm painting this one with that same Java colored chalk paint. After the paint was all dry, I used hot glue on the back of my word cutout and attached it to the center of my wood plank. Then it was time to attach my plank to my wreath, so I'm tying 2 pieces of jute together, and I did this twice because I'm going to be doing one on each side, and then I'm hot gluing those on the back top side of my wood plank. I was going to use my staple gun to attach these, but I thought my staples might be a little bit too long, so I ended up just doing the hot glue. And then I placed that in the center of my wreath and tied those jute pieces around my wreath. And here is my welcome fall rag wreath all finished. I love all of these colors together. I've really been into all of the different yellow tones for fall this year. Now moving right along into DIY number 2. For this one, I'm using this palette riser from the Target dollar spot. I think this was either from last year or the year before, but I'm finally using it. And I'm painting it with my folk art paint in the color Vintage Mustard. I only had to do 1 coat of this paint. Then once it was all dry, I wanted to give it a distressed look. So I took my Java colored paint and I dry brushed that on the entire piece. I did the edges and then I ran kind of like what was left over on my brush along the front pieces. For this project, I'm also using these Scrabble tiles. I'm spelling out 4 different fall words. I'm doing pumpkins, leaves, hayrides, and cider. You can do any kind of fall words that you like, but I really like these ones. So I just centered all of my tiles on each one of my wood planks, and then I took each tile and hot glued it down. I picked these ones up from Amazon and I will have them linked down in the description box, but I believe that Dollar General has some of these as well. Next, I'm using this piece of a branch that I got out of my backyard. I just cut it down to the size I want to create my pumpkin stem, and then I hot glued that on the top of my palette. To add some detail to the top of my pumpkin, I'm using a few strips of raffia and tying them around the top branch and just creating a really simple bow. And then I'm just cutting the ends of the raffia off to the length that I want, and then I'm using some hot glue to hold down my bow and just keep it in place. Next, I'm using one of these leaves from this fall stem piece that I got from Dollar Tree. I really love the more orangey color leaves for this particular project, so I just cut one of them off, and then I'm hot gluing that to the very top of my palette right behind my bow. And then I'm also using some of the berry garland, also from Dollar Tree. I'm wrapping it around my finger to give it a little bit of a curly look, and then I'm using some hot glue to attach that on the opposite side of my branch. And this is my palette pumpkin all finished. This could not have been an easier project, and I just love the way that this one turned out. Now moving into DIY number 3. For this one, I'm using this piece that came from Dollar Tree from around Valentine's Day. It's just the perfect size for what I need. So I'm painting that with my Waverly paint in the color Plaster, and I did do 2 coats of this paint. Then I'm going to be using 4 of these square unfinished wood tiles. These I did get in a giant pack from Amazon, and I will have them linked in my description box. And I stained all 4 of them with my Craftsmart wood stain in the color brown, and I just used an old towel to apply the stain. For this project today, I'm also using some of these Scrabble tile stencils that I just recently picked up. I got the full alphabet, but for today's project, since I have 4 tiles, I'm going to be spelling out the word fall, F-A-L-L. So I'm just taking my stencil and I'm lining it up and centering it onto my wood tile, which is pretty much the same size as my stencil. And then I'm using painter's tape on each side of the stencil, and I'm just taping it around the wood piece so that my stencil stays in place and I have nice, crisp, clean lines without it moving around. And I did this for all 4 of the letters. And I did wait for each one of the letters to dry before peeling off my stencil, just to make sure I didn't have any bleeding or anything like that. I'm going to be having all of my letters standing up, but the wood's not very thick, so I need to create a base. For this, I'm hot gluing 2 of the tumbling tower blocks from Dollar Tree together, and then I'm hot gluing those in the center bottom portion of my wood tile. And this is just going to help my letter piece stand up without falling over. And again, I just did this 4 different times for each one of my letters. I have all of my tiles spaced out the exact way I want them to be once they're attached. I always like to set everything out before attaching it, just so I don't have any mess ups later on. To attach all of my tiles, I'm just lifting them up, placing hot glue on the bottom of the towering tumbling blocks, and then just placing them back down into place. Here is the fall sign all finished. This is perfect if you're looking for a super easy last minute fall decor idea, and I just really love the way that this looks. Now moving into DIY number 4. For this one, I'm going to be using one of these crates from Dollar Tree, and I'm also using 3 of these small dowel rods also from Dollar Tree. The first thing I'm doing for this project is painting my crate with the Waverly paint in the color plaster, and then I'm also painting all 3 of the dowel rods with that same plaster color. Once all of the paint has dried, I'm then going to be attaching 2 of the rods on the inner slat of my crate, and to do that I'm just placing hot glue on the inside of the crate and then pressing each rod on top of the glue and just holding that until the glue sets so that it doesn't move around. Then I'm going to be attaching the 3rd rod to the very top of the 2 other rods, and again, to do that, just using a little bit of hot glue. Next, I'm creating a small banner. I took 2 pieces of jute and tied them together, and this is going to be like the base of the banner. And then I'm using this checked ribbon from Hobby Lobby, and I just tied it in a knot around the 2 pieces of jute and then pushed it up to the top knot on the jute. And then I'm also going to be using 2 more pieces of jute. These ones are going to be a little bit smaller in length, and then I'm just tying those around the other 2 pieces of jute and pressing them up next to the checked ribbon. And I continue just rotating through those 2, the jute and the checked ribbon, until I got all the way down to the length of my banner that I'm going to want to have. And then once I got to the end, I just tied a knot on the other 2 like base pieces of jute. I hope that made sense. And then some of my ribbon and my jute pieces were a little bit too long, so I just trimmed those up a bit. And then I attached my banner to the top of my dowels. I actually did not see that my camera had stopped filming this, but I just used hot glue on each side of the dowel rods to attach the garland. Next, I'm going to be using this little wooden piece. This came in the unfinished wood, like assorted pack that you can get from Dollar Tree. And I'm going to be painting this with that Java color chalk paint from Folk Art. And then once I have that painted, I let that sit and dry, and I actually created this Farm Fresh pumpkins little cutout on my Cricut. If you don't have a Cricut, you could always use some stickers. And I just transferred that onto the wooden piece right in the center, and then I hot glued that wood piece on the front of my crate. Then it was time to fill up my crate, so I'm filling mine with some Spanish moss that I picked up from Dollar Tree, and then on top of the Spanish moss, I'm going to be using some of these really cute mini pumpkins that I picked up at Joann Fabrics this year. They did have a few different colors, but I only have these green ones on hand at home, so I just placed them right on top of my Spanish moss. This is what my Farm Fresh Pumpkins little crate looks like. I think it is super cute and it was really easy to create. Now moving into the 5th and final DIY today, I'm going to be making some tiered pumpkins. For this one, I'm using 3 different size pumpkins, a larger, a medium, and a smaller one. 2 of these are from Dollar Tree, and I think one of them might be from Walmart. I first started by removing all of the stems of all 3 of my pumpkins. Then I decided to paint my pumpkins. You can leave them as is. I just wanted mine to be a few different colors. So this larger one that I'm placing on the bottom, I use the vintage mustard color from Folk Art. And then the medium one that you see me have here, I'm painting that with the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Hazy. This hazy color is a little more sheer, so I did have to do 3 different coats of this color on my pumpkin. And then for the smallest pumpkin, I'm painting that with the plaster color from Waverly. Then to add a little bit more of like a realistic look or add some detail to my pumpkins, I took a small paintbrush and I used the hazelnut color from Waverly, and I pretty much just dry brushed this color on all of the grooves of the pumpkin. Some areas I had a little bit more paint on my brush than others, but I think it looks a little bit more real that way, even though they don't really look real. And then for the white pumpkin, I did the same thing. I used that small brush again with the hazelnut color, only this time I ended up adding a second color in all of the grooves of the pumpkin. I used some Java from Folk Art right over top of that hazelnut color, and you can't really see it on camera, but the 2 colors really added a lot of dimension, and I just love the way that that looks. Then for the hazy colored pumpkin, I used that same hazelnut color in all of the grooves, only this time I ended up using the plaster color in all of the grooves over top of the hazelnut color. Just added a lot to my pumpkin. Then it was time to start adding some Spanish moss. You could leave this out if you don't like Spanish moss, but I really love the look of it. So I'm using some hot glue to attach it to the top of my mustard colored pumpkin. And then once that was all attached, I then used hot glue on the bottom of my hazy colored pumpkin and placed that right on top of the bottom pumpkin on the Spanish moss. And then I'm sure you can figure out what's going to happen next. I just placed more Spanish moss on the top of my middle pumpkin and then hot glued that very top smallest pumpkin on that Spanish moss. Then I just placed my stem back in the very top pumpkin, and then I'm using one of these leaves off of this fall stem. I forget where the stem is from, but I've had it in my stash forever, and I just figured this leaf was the perfect size. So I cut that off and then I hot glued it right next to the top stem on my pumpkin. And then I wanted to add some of the berry garland from Dollar Tree, so I just cut a small piece of that off. I curled it up around my finger, and then I added that right next to the leaf on the top of my pumpkin, and again, just used hot glue to attach it. Then for the last step in this project, I used 2 pieces of jute, and then I'm just making a really simple shoelace bow, and then I'm attaching that bow at the very top of my pumpkin in front of my stem. Here are my tiered pumpkins all finished. I've seen these all over in so many different stores. And what's great about this project is you can really customize it to fit with your own home decor. For DIY number 1, I'm making a Raphia pumpkin wreath. And for this one, I just started out with the 10-inch wreath form from Dollar Tree and some of the Raphia. And I did cut the Raphia down about half of the length that it comes in because it is really long. I then started tying the Raphia around the wreath form, and then I tied it once, and then I was like, oh, this probably isn't going to stay in place very well, so I did a knot on each piece of Raphia that I'm going to be tying around my wreath form. I then continued that same step, just taking some strips of Raphia, tying them around my wreath form, and then making sure that they are knotted as well. And then to hold them into place a little bit better, I started by putting hot glue right onto the wreath form and then just pressing my strips of Raphia that I made with a knot onto the glue to make sure that they don't move around. I then just continued that step over and over again of tying strips of Raphia around my wreath form and then attaching them with some hot glue until I had my entire wreath form covered in Raphia. After I was all done tying on all of the strips of Raphia, I did go through with some scissors and trim up the really long pieces. Some of them were extremely long and my wreath was looking super messy, so I needed to trim those up a little bit. And for the pieces that I'm trimming off, I did end up using those to fill in some of the spaces that you could see my wreath form. So I just bent those pieces in half and then just poked them in like all the spaces where you could see the wreath form, and I attached those pieces using some hot glue. Now I'm taking some of these pumpkins with clips on them, and I'm just taking the clips and the stems right off of the pumpkins. I am using 4 of these pumpkins for this wreath, and they do come in packs of 3, so I did use 2 packs of pumpkins for this. And I'm painting them with the Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. And to speed up the process a little bit, I would paint half of the pumpkin with the ivory color, and then I used my hair dryer to dry the paint. And then once the paint was dry, then I would just paint the other side of the pumpkin and then use my hair dryer once again to dry that paint. It made the process so much faster, so if you have like a little fan or a hair dryer and want to get this project done really quick, I highly suggest using one of those. And I did go ahead and do 2 coats of paint on all 4 of these pumpkins. Then I'm taking some of the Waverly chalk paint in the color Hazelnut on a really small paintbrush, and I'm painting this color in all of the grooves of the pumpkin. This is going to give my pumpkin some more detail and give them a more realistic look, and I am doing this to all 4 of the pumpkins that I painted with that ivory color. Next, I'm taking these pumpkins that come on a stick. These obviously are also from Dollar Tree, and I'm painting them with the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Sage. I am using 5 of these pumpkins for my wreath, and they come in packs of 5, which is really great. I did 2 coats of paint on all 5 of these pumpkins, and I did the same process as I did with my other pumpkins. only since these ones are on a stick, I didn't have to paint just half of the pumpkin. I could paint the whole thing at one time, and then I dried it really fast with my hairdryer. Once that paint was all dry, I then went in with the Waverly chalk paint in the color Hazelnut and added that to all of the grooves around my pumpkin. And then once I had the hazelnut color on, I wanted to add a little bit of that ivory color on the pumpkin as well. So I just dry brushed the ivory color in between like all of the grooves of the pumpkin and then on the top and the bottom of all 5 of the pumpkins. These pumpkins do have 2 sticks. There's a top stick and a bottom stick. The bottom one I just pulled out of all of the pumpkins, and then the top one I left in for the stem of my pumpkin, and then I painted those with that Waverly chalk paint in the color Hazelnut. Now that I have all of my pumpkins painted, I'm placing the stems back into the ones that I painted the ivory color, and I had a little bit of wet paint on my hands, so here I'm just touching up the stems with the hazelnut color wherever I just accidentally got paint on that you saw me do here. And I am leaving the clips off of those pumpkins. And now I'm going to be making the bow for my wreath. I'm using some of this burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, and I'm cutting 3 strips, a large, medium, and small, and then I'm hot gluing the ends of the strip together to form a circle. I did not measure all 3 of the strips that I cut. I just kind of go with however long I think I want my bow to be, and then I cut a large, medium, and small piece and then just make those into circles. For the large one that you see me have here, I just folded that in half and I'm having the loops facing downward. For the medium ribbon that I cut, I folded that one in half as well and I'm having the loops facing upward. And then for the small one, I'm just placing that right in the center and then bunching that up in the center of that piece. Then I'm taking some cotton cord. I believe this cotton cord is from Hobby Lobby. It might be from Michael's, but I'm pretty sure it's from Hobby Lobby. I'm tying that around several times in the middle of my bow, and then I'm just taking the ends of that, tying those off on the back side, and then I'm using a little bit of hot glue to hold all of the cotton cord into place. Then to attach my burlap bow, I'm taking some hot glue and I'm placing it on the front side of my wreath form right over top of the raffia, and then placing my bow over top of the glue. And I did hold that bow into place until the glue dried. I'm then taking all of my pumpkins and I'm placing them on the front of my wreath to get an idea of where I want to attach them. Then to attach them, I just took some hot glue, placed it on the back side of each pumpkin, and then placed it right down on top of the raffia, and I held each pumpkin into place until the glue was dry so that they didn't move around. Then for the last step, I'm creating my hanger. And for my hanger, I just used a doubled piece of jute. I made it into the length that I want my hanger to be, tied that off in a knot, and then I'm hot gluing that on the top back side of my wreath form. Here is my Raphia pumpkin wreath all finished. I think it turned out super cute, and even better, it was easy and inexpensive to create. I've seen wreaths similar to this at Michael's and Joann Fabrics, and they are way more expensive than what it took for me to create this one. Now moving right on into DIY number 2, I'm making potted pumpkins. For this one, I took this Harvest Blessings hanging sign from Dollar Tree, and I started by painting it with the Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. I did paint the front and the sides of this sign. For the front, I did 3 coats of the paint, and then for the sides, I did 2 coats. The front had the words on it, so it just took an extra coat to get those all covered up. Once all of my paint was dry, I then took my Craftsmart wood stain in the color brown, and I used an old towel to apply it to the front and all of the sides of this sign. I did apply it really messily because I wanted this piece to have a really rustic look to it. After the wood stain dried, I then took my Waverly chalk paint in the color Java, and I dry brushed that around all of the sides and then just a tiny bit on the front side of this piece. Next, I moved on to my pots, and I'm taking that same Craftsmart wood stain in the color brown on an old towel, and I'm wiping it just kind of randomly all over all 3 pots. These are the small pots from Dollar Tree, and they do come in a pack of 3, and I'm using all 3 of them for this project. And I did put some of that stain along the inside edge of my pots as well. Once the stain was all dry, I then took my folk art chalk paint in the color Java on an old chip brush, and I started just dabbing that color over top of the stain. And this is going to give my pots a really nice textured look. Once the Java colored paint was all dry, I then took the Waverly paint in the color Ivory on a chip brush as well, and I just dabbed that over top of the stain and the Java color. This is going to give my pot even more texture and give me the really nice distressed look that I'm going for. Now moving on to my pumpkins, I'm using 3 of these pumpkins with clips on them, and I'm just removing the clips and the stems from all of the pumpkins. These do come in a pack of 3 at Dollar Tree, and they have them in this like creamy color, and then they also have them in orange. I did not have the orange ones, so I'm painting mine orange myself, and the color that I'm using is from Waverly, and it is the color pumpkin. I just painted all 3 of those pumpkins with this pumpkin colored chalk paint, and I did 2 coats of this paint on all of them. Then I took my Waverly chalk paint in the color hazelnut, and I just really messily painted all 3 of the stems with this color paint. Then I'm taking that same hazelnut colored paint on a small paintbrush, and I'm just kind of like dry brushing that color in all of the grooves of the pumpkin. This is going to give my pumpkin a little bit more dimension and make it look somewhat more realistic. After the paint on my pumpkins was all dry, I then put the stems back into all 3 pumpkins. Next, I'm assembling my stand. I'm taking all 3 of the pots that I painted and I'm placing them on the front of the sign that I painted. And I'm just making sure that those are all centered and spaced out exactly how I want them. And then I'm just taking some hot glue and I'm placing it on the bottom of each pot and then just setting that back down into place. Now I'm taking some Spanish moss and I'm placing a little amount of this in each one of my pots. I'm also using some raffia. I took strips of raffia and I just cut them down into really small pieces, and then I'm placing those small pieces in each one of my pots right on top of the Spanish moss. I'm then placing my pumpkins on the tops of my pots, and I'm taking that Spanish moss and raffia that's in each one of my pots and I'm just pulling it out around the pumpkin a little bit so that you can see it. To add some more detail to my pots, I'm taking some of this buffalo check ribbon that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. They do have similar ribbon to this at Dollar Tree, but I already had this one on hand. And I just measured it around the underneath the lip of my pot, and then I'm cutting 3 strips of it. I'm then taking some hot glue and just attaching it to the underneath lip of each one of my pots. Next, I'm painting some wood letters that spell out the word fall. These ones are from Hobby Lobby, but they do have wood letters also at Dollar Tree. Again, I just had these ones on hand, so I just used what I already had, and I'm painting them with the Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory, and I only had to do 1 coat of paint on all of my letters. Once the paint on my letters was all dry, I then started attaching them to the front side of my stand. I just placed hot glue on the back side of each letter and then just set it down into place where I wanted it to be. Because I wanted to add a little bit more detail to my stand, I decided to use some of these wood leaf stickers that I picked up from Dollar Tree last year, and I'm painting them with the Waverly paint in the color Ivory. And then once I had all that ivory color on and it was all dry, I then took some of my folk art chalk paint in the color Moss, and I just very, very lightly painted that on the front of both leaves. I just wanted these leaves to have a little bit more detail to them, so I just painted them this way, and I did really like this green color. Then for the stems, I used the Waverly paint in the color Hazelnut, and then to attach the leaves, I used some hot glue on the back side of both of them and then just placed them down in between my pots. Here are my potted pumpkins all finished. This project again was super easy and inexpensive to create. This would be the perfect fall piece on top of a mantle or used as tabletop decor. Now for the third and final DIY today, I'm making a welcome pumpkin sign. For this one, I took these unfinished wooden pumpkins. They do come in a pack of 5, and since I'm going to be using 7 of them, I did have to use 2 packs of them. And I took some wood filler and I wanted to fill the holes that were in all of the pumpkins, so I just put a small amount of wood filler in all of the holes on all 7 pumpkins. After the wood filler was all dry, I then used a small piece of sandpaper and just sanded off all of the extra wood filler that was still on there so that I had a nice smooth surface for all of my pumpkins. Next, I'm painting all of my pumpkins, and the color I'm using is from Waverly, and it's the chalk paint in the color Pumpkin. I only had to paint one coat of paint on each one of them. Then for all of the stems, I used my folk art chalk paint in the color Java. Next, I wanted to give my pumpkins a little bit more detail, so I'm taking my Waverly paint in the color Ivory on a small paintbrush, and I'm just making the outlines of like where the grooves of a pumpkin would be, and then I'm painting that same color around all of the outside edges of all 7 of my pumpkins. Now that I have all of my pumpkins painted, I'm moving on to painting my unfinished wooden letters. These ones are from Dollar Tree, and I'm using the letters that spell out the word welcome. The paint color I'm using on them is the Waverly in the color Ivory once again, and I only did one coat of paint on each letter. Now it's time to assemble everything together. I'm just taking all of my wood letters and I'm placing them in the center of all of my pumpkins. I like to do this beforehand before I start gluing everything down, just so I can have an idea of where everything needs to be. Once I had them all set where I wanted them to be, I just put some hot glue on the back side of each letter and then just placed it back down into place on top of my pumpkin. Now I'm going to be attaching all of my pumpkins together. I flipped all of the pumpkins over to their back side, and you want to make sure that you keep the letters in order because there's nothing worse than attaching them and then flipping it over and your word being misspelled. And then to attach them together, I'm using this cotton cord from Hobby Lobby, and I'm just placing the hot glue on the back side of my pumpkin and then attaching the cotton cord to the hot glue. And I'm just doing that on each side of the pumpkin with the cotton cord, and I'm continuing this step all the way around each side of the pumpkins. This is my welcome pumpkin sign all finished. I ended up placing mine just on a shepherd's pole out front, and I think it turned out super cute, and it could not have been an easier project. For the first DIY today, I'm going to be using one of these round signs from Dollar Tree. This one was from back in the summertime, and I am going to be using the back of this sign for the front of mine today. I peeled off that sticker, and then I'm painting it with 2 coats of my Waverly chalk paint. For this project, I'm also using 11 of these unfinished wood leaves from Dollar Tree. All of them did have a pre-drilled hole in the very top, and I wanted to fill that in. So to do that, I'm using a little bit of wood filler. I just placed the filler on my finger and then pressed it into all of the holes on all of the leaves. And I did let that completely dry before sanding away any of the extra filler that had dried. I wanted to have a nice smooth surface for when I painted all of my leaves. For the first 3 leaves, I'm painting them with a color that I created. I mixed the color Tuscan Red, Vintage Mustard, and Java, all from Folk Art, to create this like really deep burgundy color. And I really love the way that this color ended up looking at the end. Then I painted 3 more of the leaves with the Vintage Mustard color, also from Folk Art. And then I did 3 more leaves with a color called River Walk. And then for the last 2 leaves, I painted those with a color called Whispering Wheat. For all of the stems on my leaves, I painted all of them with the Java color from Folk Art. Then I wanted to add a little bit of detail to all of my leaves. So for the 3 that I painted with the Vintage Mustard color, I took a little bit of that Java color and I dry brushed it around all of the edges of the leaves, and then the paint that was left over on my brush, I just rubbed that around on the top surface just to give it kind of like a realistic leaf look. And then I did that same thing to the 2 leaves that were painted with the color Whispering Wheat. For the ones that were painted in this like burgundy color and then also the Riverwalk color, I used hazelnut from Waverly, and I did that same thing. I just dry brushed that around all of the edges and then a little bit on the front of the leaves. I'm also using this Gather Wood word cutout, and this is from Joann Fabrics. I painted the entire word with the Java colored paint. Now that I have everything all painted, I can start assembling everything. I'm using the circle that I painted on the bottom, and then I'm placing all of my leaves around the edges of that circle. And I had the leaves overlapping each other a little bit, and I just spaced them out color-wise how I thought they looked nice. And then once I had it all planned out, and then I started hot gluing all of my leaves around the edges of my circle. And like I said, I did have them spaced to where some of the leaves were overlapping each other, so I would glue the one end of the leaf on top of the other, and then the other side of the leaf I would place down onto the actual circle. I hope that made sense. And then once I had those all glued around the edges, and then I just hot glued my gather word right into the center. Then for the very last step, I need to attach a hanger, so I'm using some of this white cotton cord from Hobby Lobby, and I just cut it down to size and hot glued that on the back side. And here is my gather wreath sign. It could be a sign or you could call it a wreath. It was super easy to create and it only cost me a few dollars, and I think it looks really high end. Now moving into the second DIY today. For this one, I'm using 4 of these unfinished wood frames. These did come from Hobby Lobby and you can get them in a pretty large pack. I think it comes in a pack of 6. And I first started by just removing the backs from all of the frames. And then since I'm not going to be using the little hanger things that are on the sides of all of them, I just unscrewed them and removed them from all 4 of my frames. Then I'm using my Craft Smart wood stain in the color brown on an old towel to apply stain to all 4 of my frames. This is a water-based stain. I don't think Michaels makes this anymore, but you can find water-based stains at pretty much any hardware or craft store, or you could create your own with some paint. Then for the backs of all of the frames, I'm using my plaster color from Waverly. And then I'm also going to be using a couple of these wooden letters. These ones are from Joann Fabrics, and I'm using the letter F, LL, and then I used one of these unfinished wood leaves that I had in my craft stash, and obviously I'm spelling out the word fall. For the letters, I'm painting those all with the vintage mustard color from Folk Art. Then for the leaf, I'm using that same color that I just created in the last project, the Tuscan red, vintage mustard, and a little bit of Java mixed together to create this really pretty burgundy color. So I just painted 1 coat of that on the leaf. And then for the stem of the leaf, I just painted that with the Java colored paint. To add a little bit of detail to my leaf, I'm using a little bit of the hazelnut color from Waverly, and I'm dry brushing that around all of the outside edges of my leaf and then just a little bit along the front as well. Then it's time to place everything back together, so I'm putting the backs back into all of my frames. And then I wanted to start placing everything together to see how I wanted it before I started gluing it. You guys know I always like to do this because if I don't, then I end up making a mistake. So I'm just placing all of my letters and leaves in the center, and then I'm starting to hot glue each one of them down right in the center of all of my frames. Next, I'm gluing all of my frames together. I used hot glue on the sides of the frames F and the one with the leaf, and then just press them together. But to make sure that they will really stay together, I'm using some popsicle sticks on the back side just to make sure that they don't move around or come apart. And then I did the same thing for the other frames. I just hot glued the 2 sides together, and then I used some popsicle sticks on the back side just to ensure a really nice hold and for me to know that they are not going to fall apart. Then I wanted to add a different kind of hanger to this sign. I'm using some berry garland from Dollar Tree, and I use 2 strands of it. And at first I thought it was a good idea to use my staple gun to attach it to the back, but then I realized after doing so that my wood is way too thin and my staple went through the front of my F frame. So I ended up having to just touch that up with a little bit of paint, and you couldn't see where the hole was in the front. But since I couldn't use my staple gun, I ended up having to use some hot glue to attach the berry garland on the back. You just want to make sure that you're holding it in place until the glue completely sets, because if you don't, it will pop right off because this is a little bit of a heavier item. I did that to both sides, and that was the last step for this project. I think this one turned out super cute. I love all of the colors together, and it is a little bit different than anything I've recently seen. Moving right along into DIY number 3. For this one, I'm using this Welcome Friends pumpkin standing sign from Dollar Tree. And I first started just by removing the sunflower and then the burlap part that was over top of the pumpkin, which I ended up not even really needing to do because I ended up using the back of the sign for the front of mine. And then I painted the front of the pumpkin with my vintage mustard color from Folk Art. I did have to do 2 coats of that paint. And then I did the stem of the pumpkin with my Java colored paint. And then I did want to add a little bit of distressing, so I used that same Java color around all of the edges of the pumpkin. And then I took the leftover paint that was on the brush and just very lightly painted that over the front of the pumpkin. Next, I'm going to be using this old sweater. This is, or was going to be donated, and I just decided to use it for crafting. So at first I thought I was going to cover the entire front of the pumpkin with a sweater and then have like a pumpkin cutout, but I ended up changing my mind. So here I'm just cutting the sweater down a little bit to the size that I'm going to want to place over top of my pumpkin. So I just cut the sleeve and ended up just cutting pretty much like a rectangle shape. Then once I had my sweater all cut out, it was time to start attaching it. So I just had it go across the very front of my pumpkin, and then I hot glued the 2 ends of the sweater along the back side. And I did pull the sweater so it was kind of tight along the front of the pumpkin. And again, just use the hot glue to attach it to the back side. Then I'm going to be using this really pretty yellow ribbon from Joann Fabrics, and I'm just cutting it down to size, and then I'm gluing that right in the center of the sweater going along the front of the pumpkin, and then hot gluing the 2 ends of that ribbon along the back side of the pumpkin right over top of the sweater. I'm also using this Give Thanks word cutout. This came from the Target dollar spot in a kit this year, but I'm just going to be using the word cutout for this project. And then I painted all of it with the Waverly paint in the color Plaster. Once the paint was all dry, I then hot glued the word cutout in the center of my ribbon on top of my pumpkin. Then I wanted to add some details to the pumpkin. I'm using some of this like floral leaves from a Hobby Lobby pick that I got this year, and I just hot glued that right to the top underneath of the stem of the pumpkin. And then I added some of these mini pine cones that are from Dollar Tree, and then I used some more of this berry garland also from Dollar Tree. I just cut it down to a pretty small piece, and then I folded those or wrapped them around my finger to create kind of like a curly Q look, and then hot glued that underneath the pine cones. This is my Give Thanks pumpkin tabletop sign. This goes perfect with the colors that I'm using in my home for this fall, and it was, again, super easy to create this project. Now for the 4th DIY today. For this one, it's super easy. I'm using one of these wooden hanging pieces. This is from, I think, the Target dollar spot last year, but it has both a stained side and a white side to it. I'm using the white side for this project, and I'm also using this Gather Together stencil from Amazon, and I will have it linked down in the description box. So I'm just placing my stencil right over top of my wood, and it's pretty much the perfect size. Then to hold the stencil into place, I'm using some painter's tape around the 2 sides, and then also the top of the stencil as well, just so that it doesn't move around when I'm trying to paint. Then I'm going to be covering up the word gather in a few different places with my painter's tape. This is going to make sure that I don't get any of the color that I'm going to be painting the pumpkin onto the word, because I am going to be painting those 2 different colors, and this is just going to help me from having to do extra painting later on. So once I have the word gather covered up, or in all of the places that I might get paint covered up, then I'm starting to paint my pumpkin, and for the pumpkin color, I'm using the vintage mustard color once again. You guys know I love this color for fall, so I'm using it in a lot of my fall projects this year. And to paint it, I just used one of my Dollar Tree stencil brushes. After I had my pumpkin painted and the paint dried, I then removed the painter's tape from the word gather, and then you guessed it, I ended up using that same painter's tape or some of the little pieces, and I placed those over top of some of the places that I just painted the pumpkin. so that I didn't get any of the paint that I'm going to be painting my word gather onto the places that I already painted my pumpkin. Then for the stem of the pumpkin, I'm using the Java colored paint from Folk Art with a Dollar Tree stencil brush to apply the paint. And then I'm also using that same color for the words gather and then also the word together at the bottom. Then for the vine that's at the very top of the stencil, I'm using the color Sage Shadow from Folk Art. Then I let all of my paint completely dry so that I didn't have any bleeding underneath of my stencil and onto my wood before I started removing all of the painter's tape and my stencil. For the last step in this project, I'm using some of this yellow ribbon from Joann Fabrics. I'm creating a really simple bow, and then I'm cutting the ends of that ribbon in a diagonal, and then I'm just hot gluing that on the top left-hand side of my sign. And here is my Gather Together sign all finished. This one is another super easy project that is perfect if you're looking for a last minute project that looks high end. Moving right along into DIY number 5, for this one I'm using this unfinished slatted wood pumpkin from Dollar Tree. And I first started by removing the jute hanger that's at the top of the pumpkin so that it would be a little bit easier for me to stain and paint the pumpkin. I am using my Craftsmart wood stain in the color brown to stain the 2 slats on the very edges of the pumpkin, and then I also use that same stain on the center slat of the pumpkin as well. Then for the other 2 slats of my pumpkin, I painted those with the Vintage Mustard paint color from Folk Art. I did do 2 coats of this paint. Then I wanted to add a little bit of distressing, so once all of that stain and paint was all dry, I used some of my plaster colored paint from Waverly on just like a stencil brush, and I very lightly dry brushed that color over top of the entire pumpkin to give it more of a rustic look. Next, I'm using these wood letters to spell out the word hello. These are either from Joann's, Michael's, or Hobby Lobby. I can't remember, but I'm just painting them all with the plaster color from Waverly. And then I'm also going to be using this pumpkin word cutout, and this is from Michael's this year. It did come in a pack that said hello pumpkin, but I didn't like the font that was on the hello word. It was a little bit different than this pumpkin word, so I ended up using the single letters along with this word cutout. And the pumpkin cutout I'm also painting with the plaster color. Then once that was all dry, I just started placing on my letters in the center just to get them all in place before I started gluing them down. And the same thing with my pumpkin word. And then to glue them down, I am using hot glue on the back side of each letter and also my pumpkin word. I found this really pretty ribbon at Joann Fabrics. It is perfect for fall. I'm creating a really simple bow with it, and then for the tail ends, I'm just cutting those off in a diagonal shape. And then before I add the bow, I'm adding some of this fall floral stems. This did come from one of those picks, and I just cut it off, and I'm hot gluing it at the bottom of my stem on my pumpkin. And then I'm also using one of these fall leaves that I cut off of one of my fall picks, and I'm just hot gluing that on, going in the opposite direction of the other florals on my pumpkin. And then it was time to hot glue my bow right in the center. For the last step in this project, I did need to add on a hanger, so I'm using this white cotton cord from Hobby Lobby, but I thought it would be a little bit different if I did it on the front. So I just cut my cotton cord down to size, and then I created a knot on each end of the cotton cord, and then instead of doing it on the back, I just hot glued that right over top of the pre-drilled holes in my pumpkin, and I think it added a really cute detail. And here is my Hello Pumpkin sign all finished. I really love the rustic look of this one, and it is super easy to do, just like the rest of the projects in today's video. Now for the 6 DIY today. For this one, I'm using 2 pieces of wood. These I did pick up from Lowe's, and they are 24 inches by 3.5 inches. And then I painted both of them with my Waverly paint in the color plaster, and I did 1 coat of paint on both pieces of wood. After the paint was all dry, I then used some hot glue on the sides of the pieces of wood and glued them together. Then to make sure that the wood pieces stay together, I used some popsicle sticks and I hot glued those along the back side of both pieces of wood. I'm also using this welcome word cutout from Joann Fabrics, and I'm painting it with the vintage mustard color from Folk Art. Next, I wanted to give my pieces of wood a distressed look, so I'm using some of my Java colored paint on a chip brush, and I'm dry brushing that color over top of my wood. Then I'm taking a piece of my burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, and I'm cutting that down to size, and then fraying out the edges of the ribbon. I'm then taking that ribbon and placing it on the top of my pieces of wood, and then wrapping the edges around to the back side, and then using some hot glue to just glue those pieces down. Then I'm just placing my wood pieces, the welcome word, and then I'm also using these letters to spell out the word fall, and I'm just placing them on my sign to get them where I want them to be before I glue them down. These are from another sign that I had that fell apart, but I really liked them, so I'm just reusing them on my sign here. But you can find letters or single letters like this at pretty much any craft store, or even Walmart sells them. I just loved these, and they were already stained to the color that I wanted. So I got all of them all glued down, and then I'm using some of this berry garland from Dollar Tree, which you've seen me use in pretty much every fall video this year. I first started wrapping it around the very top of my sign, and I was using hot glue, and obviously the hot glue wasn't working, but this wood is thick enough that I can use my staple gun. So I just stapled the berry garland along the back side just to hold it into place so that it doesn't move around, and I wrapped it around in several different areas to where I thought it looked good. So there was no like special way of doing it. I just kept working with it until I thought it looked nice, and that was the last step for this project. And this is my welcome fall sign all finished. I ended up placing it on my front porch stacked on a hay bale, and it is just so simple and super cute with the rest of my outside fall decor. Now for the 7th and final DIY today. For this one, I'm going to be using 4 of these rectangle signs from Dollar Tree. 2 of them I think are from last year, and 2 of them are from this year. And I'm going to start by painting 2 of them with the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Whispering Wheat. I did have to do 3 coats of this paint to get everything all covered up. Then for the remaining 2, I am doing this one with this burgundy color that I created. I used the color Tuscan Red with a little bit of Java and just a tiny bit of the vintage mustard color from Folk Art. I mixed those together to create this really pretty burgundy color, and I did 2 of the signs that color. Then I'm using this Grateful, Thankful, and Blessed word cutouts. These are from Hobby Lobby, and they do all come in one pack together. And I'm painting all of them with the Waverly paint in the color Plaster. Once all of my paint was dry, I then wanted to do a little bit of distressing. So for the ones that I painted with that Whispering Wheat color, I dry brushed the Java color over top of those to de-stress, and then the ones that are the burgundy color, I used my hazelnut color from Waverly and just dry brushed that over top. Next, I started attaching all 4 of my signs together. I did do every other color, and I used hot glue to attach them together. I just placed the glue on the bottom of each sign and pressed it against the other one until all 4 of them were attached. Then I just placed my words in the middle, kind of where I wanted them to be, so I could plan out how I want to do my ribbon. I ended up using some of this burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, and then I cut it right down the middle to make them a little bit thinner, and then I did fray out the edges of the ribbon. Then I wanted to have them on each side, the right and the left side of my sign, so I just wrapped it around the front, and then I hot glued the edges of the ribbon along the back side of my sign, and I did this again for both sides. Next, it was time to attach all of my words, and I did want the sign to read Grateful, Thankful, Blessed, so I just placed them in order, and then to attach them, I used hot glue on the back side of each word and just made sure they were centered in the middle of my sign. To add a little bit of detail to the sides, I decided to use some more of this white cotton cord, and I just placed it right over top of my burlap ribbon in the center, and then I hot glued those end pieces around the back side. And again, I did that for both sides. Next, I'm using 3 of these wooden beads, and I'm painting them all with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I only did 1 coat of this paint on them, and then I used my hot glue to attach all of them together once the paint was dry. This sign is going to be like a pumpkin, and these beads are going to be the stem. So I just hot glued those 3 beads that are glued together in the very top of my sign. And then I'm also using this really pretty leaf that came off of one of the Dollar Tree stems, and I'm just hot gluing that right next to the beads. And then I'm also using a little bit of Spanish moss around the beads at the bottom, and I just hot glued that on. Then I'm using some of this berry garland, which I've been using in every project. I cut a small piece off, made it into like a little curly Q piece, and I hot glued that next to my stem. And here is my grateful, thankful, blessed pumpkin sign all finished. I love how all of these colors look together. It gives me that farmhouse rustic look that I love so much. And that wraps it up for all 52 of my favorite fall decor DIYs. I really hope that you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're not subscribed already. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of my future videos. As always, thank you so much for watching.